I stood on the porch, the winter wind cutting through my coat, my old suitcase slipping from my trembling hand. The front door slammed shut before I could speak. Through the frosted glass, I saw my son's shadow turn away. My own son. The house I built with my bare hands, locked to me like I was an intruder. His words still rang in my ears. "You don't live here anymore, Dad." For 70 years, I'd called this place home, but in that moment, I realized home wasn't mine. It never was. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The house felt quieter now, too quiet. Since Martha passed, the clock on the wall seemed louder, the air heavier. George Miller moved through the rooms like a ghost in his own life, each photograph, each dent in the old wooden floor, a memory that wouldn't let go. The smell of engine oil still lingered on his hands, a lifetime spent fixing other people's cars while his own family slipped away. But this house, this was his anchor, his promise to Martha. He'd always told himself he'd leave it to both his children, David and Sarah, when the time came. Split evenly, no fighting, no favoritism. It was meant to be a symbol of what their family once stood for: fairness, love, legacy. That was the plan. But plans have a way of falling apart when greed enters the room. It started with a conversation over dinner. David had come by that night, smiling that salesman smile of his wife Linda perched beside him with her perfectly polished nails and her eyes that judged every corner of the old house. "Dad," David said, swirling his wine like he owned the place. "Why wait? You could transfer the deed now. You know, before something happens." George looked up from his plate. "Before something happens?" he repeated, his voice calm but sharp. David chuckled, nervous. "You're not getting any younger, Dad. It just makes sense legally, less paperwork later." Linda leaned forward. "And it would take a load off everyone's shoulders. We could finally update this place. New floors, better lighting, maybe a proper kitchen." George's fork clinked against the plate as he set it down. "It's still my home," he said simply. There was no anger in his tone, just finality. Linda rolled her eyes. "You're making things harder than they need to be." Before George could respond, Sarah's voice cut through. "He's not making it hard, Linda. He's living in his own house. You don't get to decide when he gives it up." The tension at the table thickened. David's face hardened. "Sarah, you always have to make things dramatic. I'm just trying to help Dad." "Help yourself, you mean?" Sarah shot back. George pushed back his chair, ending the conversation before it could poison the night further. "Enough," he said quietly. "I don't want another word about this deed." But as he walked out of the room, he could feel their eyes burning into his back. Linda's with contempt, David's with something colder: calculation. Later that night, as he sat by the window, the old clock ticking beside him, George couldn't shake the unease. He'd seen that look before, on men desperate to claim something they hadn't earned, the same hunger he'd seen overseas, the kind that made sons forget fathers. The house creaked softly under the weight of memories. He traced his fingers over Martha's photograph, whispering to her as if she could still hear. "They're coming for what's ours," he said, "but I won't let them." Outside, wind brushed through the trees. The lights in David's car flickered as he backed out of the driveway without saying goodbye. Linda's silhouette beside him didn't even glance back. From the window, George watched them disappear down the road, the taillights cutting through the dark. In the silence that followed, he could feel something shifting, a boundary breaking, a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. He didn't know how deep the betrayal would go yet, but he felt it in his bones. The kind of pain that doesn't arrive with a shout, but with a whisper that lingers. It's already begun. And as the clock struck midnight, George Miller sat alone in his dimly lit home, holding his wife's photograph close, knowing that his peace, what little of it was left, was about to be stolen from him. The next Sunday dinner began like any other. Roast chicken, soft jazz humming from the old radio, and the uneasy silence that had become a regular guest at George Miller's table. He'd cooked, as always. Old habits die hard. But tonight, the warmth that used to fill these walls was gone. It felt like everyone was pretending to be a family for the sake of politeness, and George could feel the tension crawling under his skin like static. David sat across from him, scrolling through his phone between bites. Linda's perfume filled the room, too sharp, too loud for the quiet home George loved. Sarah was trying to keep the peace, cutting her chicken in silence, but her eyes flicked nervously between her father and brother. Something unspoken hung heavy in the air. Finally, David put his phone down with a sigh. "Dad," he began, voice calm, almost rehearsed, "I've been thinking, it's time we made some arrangements." George looked up slowly. "What kind of arrangements?" David leaned back, arms folded. "You're 70. You shouldn't be living alone in a house this big. It's not safe. There's a retirement home in town, Oakview. They've got good reviews, nice rooms, medical staff on site." George's fork froze midair. A retirement home. His tone wasn't anger yet, just disbelief. David pressed on. "You'd have company there, activities, meals cooked for you. It's what's best." "What's best for who?" George asked quietly. Linda's voice cut in before David could answer. "Come on, George, be reasonable. You can't handle everything yourself anymore. The house needs work, and honestly, it's falling apart. You should think about your health." Sarah's fork clattered onto her plate. "Linda, stop. You're not talking about his health. You just want the house." Linda's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's not fair. I'm thinking long term." George set his utensils down carefully, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but restraint. "You think I spent 50 years working with busted engines, fixing strangers' cars in winter storms, just to be told I can't handle my own house?" David's jaw tightened. "Dad, it's not about pride. You're holding things up. The property could be put to better use." "Better use?" George repeated, his voice low. "It's not a tool for your ambitions, David. It's my home." That word, home, seemed to sting. David slammed his hand on the table, the plates rattling. "You're holding me back. Do you get that? You're clinging to something that should have been passed down years ago. I'm trying to build a life here, but you're trying to build it with something that isn't yours yet," Sarah interrupted, her eyes blazing. "God, David, listen to yourself." Linda crossed her arms. "You always take his side, Sarah. Maybe because you're not the one doing anything with your life either." Sarah pushed back her chair, standing abruptly. "I won't sit here and listen to this garbage." "Sarah," George started, but she was already gone, footsteps echoing down the hall. The front door slammed a moment later, the sound sharp as a gunshot. The silence that followed was suffocating. David rubbed his forehead, muttering something under his breath. Linda began gathering plates, muttering about ungrateful people as she carried them to the sink. George sat there, staring at the empty seat where Sarah had been. His chest felt tight, not from his heart condition this time, but from something deeper. Betrayal has a weight to it, and tonight it settled squarely on his shoulders. He looked at his son, the boy he'd once carried on his shoulders, taught to ride a bike, taught to tell the truth. Now that boy stared back at him like a stranger. "I gave you everything I could," George said quietly. "And somehow, it's still not enough." David didn't answer. He just looked away. The old clock ticked in the corner, marking time between them like a countdown. George pushed his chair back slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "You'll regret this someday." He left the table, each step echoing like a chapter closing behind him. But as he reached the doorway, he caught the faint reflection of David and Linda in the window, leaning close, whispering. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The night air was heavy, thick with rain and resentment. George Miller sat in his armchair, the glow of the muted television flickering across the empty living room. The house no longer felt like his. It echoed with the cold laughter of people who didn't respect its history. David and Linda had come back from some dinner party, perfume and liquor trailing behind them. Their voices were sharp even before the door closed. "Dad," David's tone was clipped, the kind of voice that no longer hid its disgust. "We need to talk." George turned his head slowly. "It's nearly midnight. Can't this wait till morning?" Linda stepped forward, heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "No, it can't. We're done waiting. You've been sitting here for weeks doing nothing while we're trying to move forward. Her words cut off as she waved her hand dismissively toward him. "Just taking up space." George frowned, standing slowly. "Taking up space? Linda, this is my home. I built this life from the ground up. Every inch of this place." David interrupted, his voice rising. "You built it, yeah, 50 years ago. It's time to move on, Dad. You're not listening. You refuse to sign the papers. You're making this harder than it needs to be." George's voice trembled with disbelief. "You mean harder for you?" The argument escalated fast, too fast. Years of buried resentment, unspoken jealousy, and guilt exploded in a storm of words that couldn't be taken back. David's face twisted, veins visible in his neck. "You don't get it, do you? I've spent my whole life cleaning up after your failures. You think you're some hero because you turned a wrench and wore a uniform 50 years ago? You're pathetic, Dad. You're holding everyone back." Linda laughed, cold and sharp. "He's right, George. Look at you, living on that tiny pension, acting like some noble old soldier. You're just a burden now. Useless." The word hit him harder than any punch. Useless. George's heart pounded in his chest. "Linda, watch your mouth." "No," she said, stepping closer. "You need to hear it. You're dead weight." He took a step back, stunned, breath shallow. The man who'd once faced gunfire without flinching now felt small in his own home. "David," his voice cracked, "this house, it's all I have left. Your mother and I." "Stop using Mom as an excuse," David snapped. "She wouldn't want this. You sitting around clinging to the past. You're done here, Dad." Then, before George could respond, David moved toward the closet. He yanked open the door, grabbed a handful of shirts, and tossed them into the hallway. George froze, not believing what he was seeing. "David, what are you doing?" David didn't answer. He grabbed the next armful, coats, jackets, trousers, and stormed toward the front door. Linda followed, smirking. "Stop!" George shouted, voice cracking as thunder rolled outside. But it was too late. David flung the door open, the wind howling in. Rain splattered against the steps as he hurled his father's clothes into the yard, one piece at a time. Shirts, uniforms, photo albums. Years of memories now soaked in mud. Linda stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Maybe now you'll get the message," she sneered. George stumbled forward, hands shaking. "David, please, this is my home." David turned, eyes blazing. "Not anymore." And with a shove, harder than George expected, he pushed his father out the door. George stumbled, his cane slipping on the wet porch. The cold bit into his bones. Behind him, the door slammed, and for the first time, he felt the truth settle like ice in his chest. His own son had cast him out. The rain poured harder. His clothes clung to his body, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Across the street, a few curtains shifted, neighbors peeking out, then quickly turning away. No one came to help. He stared at the heap of his belongings scattered in the yard, his old mechanic's jacket lying face down in the mud. The headlights from David's car flickered on inside, illuminating the scene like a cruel spotlight. George bent slowly, picking up the jacket. His hands trembled as he brushed off the dirt, whispering to no one. 70 years. And this is what it comes to. He straightened, shoulders hunched, rain dripping from his gray hair. From behind the door, Linda's voice carried faintly through the noise. Let's hope he gets the hint this time. George turned toward the dark street, his silhouette shrinking as he began to walk. Each step was slow, heavy, deliberate, carrying both his shame and his grief into the night. He didn't look back, but as lightning flashed across the sky, the reflection in the wet pavement caught his face, a mix of heartbreak and something darker forming underneath. Something colder. The storm outside was fierce, but the one rising inside George Miller had only just begun. The morning after, the storm carried a cruel stillness. The rain had stopped, leaving behind puddles that mirrored a gray sky, and the faint smell of wet earth hung in the air. George Miller walked slowly down the cracked sidewalk toward his house, the house that no longer felt like his. Each step was hesitant, his cane sinking slightly into the damp ground. When he reached the front yard, he froze. His life lay scattered across the grass like garbage. Plastic bags ripped open, cardboard boxes soaked through. His clothes hung from the branches of the oak tree, fluttering like defeated flags. The rain had turned his possessions into pulp. The photographs, the letters, even Martha's old floral blanket he'd kept folded in the closet. And then he saw it. At the top of the trash heap, resting crookedly against a broken chair, was the photo frame from his wedding day. The glass was shattered, Martha's face streaked with mud, but her smile, her soft, forgiving smile, was still visible through the cracks. George's breath hitched. His knees buckled as he knelt beside the heap, trembling hands trying to rescue what could never truly be saved. He brushed the mud away, whispering her name under his breath. Martha, I'm sorry. A few neighbors stood on their porches, whispering. Their voices carried on the damp wind. Is that George? One murmured. Heard his son kicked him out. Terrible, but maybe he couldn't take care of himself anymore. George heard every word. He didn't look up. The pity was worse than the judgment. He found the small box where he'd kept Martha's wedding ring, the one she used to twist nervously during arguments. It was crushed, bent out of shape. When he saw it, something inside him cracked. A sound escaped him, low and raw, the kind that only comes from a heart breaking twice, once from love lost, and again from betrayal confirmed. He sat down in the mud, surrounded by everything he'd worked for, everything that had been taken. His hands covered his face, his shoulders shaking as the morning light broke over the ruins of his dignity. After a while, he fumbled for his phone. His fingers, stiff with age and cold, tapped Sarah's number. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. Sarah, it's Dad, he whispered. His voice caught. He swallowed hard, forcing the words out. They threw everything out, the photos. Your mom's things. He couldn't finish. Please call me. He ended the call and sat there in silence, the screen glowing faintly in his palm. Minutes felt like hours. The phone stayed quiet. Then, in the distance, a car horn blared. He turned his head, squinting. A blue sedan slowed to a stop near the curb. The door opened, and Anna stepped out. His sister, her expression dark as thunderclouds. George, she called, her voice sharp with disbelief. When she reached him, she looked around at the wreckage and covered her mouth. Oh my God! David did this. George didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence said it all. Anna's jaw tightened. That boy's gone too far, you hear me? Too far. She crouched down, helping him to his feet, brushing mud from his jacket like he was still the big brother who'd once protected her. George stared at the ruined frame in his hands one last time before setting it gently into the box. His eyes were red, not just from tears, but from something harder forming beneath them, a kind of resolve that pain can't drown. As Anna guided him toward the car, he turned his head, taking one last look at the house. Linda's laughter drifted faintly from inside, like poison carried on the wind. George's voice was low, steady, unrecognizable even to himself. "This isn't over," he said. And as the car pulled away, leaving the house behind, the morning sun broke weakly through the clouds, its light falling across the wreckage of a man who had just begun to awaken from heartbreak into vengeance. The shelter smelled faintly of bleach and old coffee. The buzz of fluorescent lights filled the air, constant and indifferent. George Miller sat on a narrow cot against the far wall, the thin blanket barely reaching his knees. Around him, men mumbled in their sleep, veterans, addicts, drifters, each carrying a story no one wanted to hear. He never thought he'd become one of them. The first night there, he didn't sleep at all. He kept staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the sounds of coughing, footsteps, and whispered prayers. His hands were clasped tightly over his chest, as though holding himself together. Every creak of the floor made him flinch. He'd faced gunfire once, decades ago, but this felt worse, because this was home that had turned against him. In the morning, one of the volunteers, a woman with kind eyes and a voice too gentle for this place, handed him a cup of coffee. "You served, didn't you?" she asked, noticing the faded military pin on his jacket. George nodded, but his voice caught before he could reply. She smiled, setting a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. "You're welcome here. You've earned better than this." He wanted to believe her, but as he glanced around the room, men lined up for day-old bread, some muttering to themselves, others staring blankly into the distance, he knew better. Dignity didn't mean much once you lost your address. He ate in silence, eyes fixed on the floor. When Anna called that afternoon, he forced a smile into his voice. "Yeah, I'm doing fine," he lied. "Staying with some friends for a bit." He didn't tell her where he really was, didn't mention the sound of the shelter door buzzing open and shut, or the way people looked at him when they found out he had a son with money and a house, but still ended up here. After the call, he sat outside on the concrete steps, watching the city move on without him. Cars rushed by, people hurried to jobs and lives, while he sat invisible among the forgotten. His reflection in the shelter window caught him off guard. Hollow eyes, gray stubble, shoulders bent for more than age. Later that week, one of the younger men, maybe 20, asked him, "What did you do to end up here, old man?" George hesitated before answering. "Trusted the wrong person." The boy laughed, thinking it was a joke. George didn't. That night, he borrowed a computer at the library to check his old email. He shouldn't have opened social media, but curiosity and heartbreak guided his hand. What he saw made his stomach twist. There it was, David's post, a series of bright, polished photos of his house, now painted in sterile whites and grays. The caption read, "Finally finished remodeling Dad's old place. New beginnings." Hundreds of likes, comments congratulating David and Linda for flipping the property so beautifully. Words like inspiring and successful filled the screen. George's jaw tightened as he scrolled through the pictures. The living room, his wife's favorite space, had been stripped of every trace of her. The old curtains Martha sewed herself were gone. The dining table where they'd shared 30 Christmases replaced by sleek glass. Even the porch swing where he'd held his newborn son was missing. He stared at the final image, David and Linda smiling in front of the house, champagne glasses raised, his home, their victory. Something inside him broke cleanly, like glass under pressure. The sadness he'd carried for weeks began to harden, crystallizing into something else, something colder. His breathing slowed, his grip on the mouse tightening until his knuckles went white. "New beginnings," he whispered, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. He closed the laptop slowly, his reflection dark in the screen. The humiliation, the pity, the betrayal. They had all led him here. But beneath it all, a different fire began to burn, quiet and deliberate. By the time he left the library, the cold evening wind cut through his coat, but he didn't feel it. He walked past glowing storefronts and families laughing over dinner, his face set in stone. Somewhere deep inside, a line had been crossed. He wasn't just a discarded father anymore. He was a man who'd been erased, and a man who intended to be remembered. On the 5th day, the phone finally rang. George had stopped expecting calls he wanted to hear. The world had become a sequence of small silences that wore on him. When Sarah's name lit the screen, his hands trembled, not from fear, but from a brittle hope he tried not to name. He answered with a voice that sounded older than his years. "Dad?" Her tone cracked on the first syllable, raw and disbelieving. What did he do to you?" The question tumbled out before she could steady it, a frantic mixture of anger and guilt. George tried to keep the shame from his voice. "They threw my things out, Sarah. He stopped, the words lodged in his throat like stones. He hadn't meant to call her a witness to his collapse, but he did. Hearing her exhale, then inhale sharply, steadied him enough to continue. I'm okay. I'll manage." "No," she snapped, more fiercely than he'd ever heard her speak. "You're not okay. Come stay with me tonight. Don't sleep out there." There was a pause, a fragile thing where he could hear the decision forming. "Please, Dad, I'll pick you up." He hesitated because of pride, because of the old, stubborn rules men like him kept, but also because of the image of Anna's worried face and the puddles of mud on his shirts. "All right," he said finally. "I'll come." When she arrived, Sarah looked smaller in the driver's seat than he remembered from childhood. Grief had thinned her, and anger had hollowed out some of her softness. She opened the door before he could unlock it, and wrapped him in a quick, fierce hug that smelled faintly of the lemon-scented soap she always used. "I'm so sorry," she said into his coat, voice muffled. "You didn't deserve that." They drove in near silence, the town sliding past in a blur of storefronts and autumn trees. Once inside her house, George found the space orderly, warm, and quietly protective, a buffer against the cruelty of the street. Sarah put out tea, fussed over him in ways that made him feel both comforted and ashamed, and when he caught sight of the framed photographs on her wall, smiles frozen in better times, he thought of Martha and the life that had once been his anchor. Sarah paced the kitchen like a caged animal while he tried to eat, stopping occasionally to hurl accusations into the air. "He had no right," she said, voice tight. "How could he, your own son, do this? I tried to talk to him. I told him to stop. He lied to me." Her hands twisted as she spoke. "I didn't know he'd stoop this low." George watched her fury, grateful but also pained by her helplessness. She loved him. He could feel it in the way she hovered, in the quiet way she made his bed on the couch that night. But she was one woman in the middle of a family torn apart, and her hands felt small against the scale of what had been done. He understood that in her bones, how loyalty could clash with powerlessness. When she went to the bedroom to fetch an extra blanket, George's eyes drifted to his phone on the coffee table. He hadn't told Sarah about David's social posts yet, hadn't wanted to poison the fragile piece of her invitation, but curiosity, like a gnawing animal, pushed him toward the screen. He scrolled and saw it, polished photos of his house, bright lighting, new fixtures, the living room stripped of the life he'd known. David and Linda posed in front of the door, smiles wide, champagne in each hand. The caption crowed, "New chapter, hard work pays off." He swallowed the bile that rose in his throat. Sarah returned and paused mid-step when she saw his face. "What is it?" He handed her the phone. She scrolled and her face went white. Anger flared into something colder, and for a heartbeat, he saw the sister he'd raised, the one who would fight anyone for him. "He's showing off," she said, barely audible. "He's rubbing it in your face." That night, Dr. Green's voice came over the phone in a soft, clinical worry. The physician's warnings were precise, the kind that stripped drama down to facts. "Your blood pressure is high, Mr. Miller. Stress like this, emotional trauma, can exacerbate cardiac symptoms. You need to slow down. Come in for tests. Don't make yourself a martyr." George listened, cataloging the words the way a man catalogs tools: necessary, blunt, unavoidable. He hung up and sat for a long time in the dim living room, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. The anger inside him was no longer just a flare of sorrow. It had become a steady burn that warmed him in a way grief never could. He thought of Dr. Green's warning, of the brittle weight of his own chest. He thought of the photographs in the trash, the wedding frame with its shattered glass, the way the town had watched and done nothing. The truth settled in him like concrete. "Let it kill me after I make him pay," he muttered, the sentence hardly more than a rasp. It wasn't bravado. It was a promise, and in the hush of Sarah's house, with her asleep down the hall and the town breathing quietly outside, it sounded like the first stone dropped into what would become a long, cold river. Sunday used to be George Miller's favorite day. It was the only day Martha would insist on slowing down: fresh coffee, soft gospel music, the quiet walk to church hand in hand. He'd gone every week since she passed, clinging to the rhythm, the peace. But that morning, as he walked through the church doors, peace was nowhere to be found. He felt the shift before he even sat down. Conversations dimmed when he entered. Heads turned, then quickly looked away. The whispers weren't even subtle anymore. He caught fragments as he passed down the aisle. That's him, kicked out by his own son. Shame, really. George took his seat in the back pew, his cane resting against his knee. The sunlight through the stained glass window painted his face in fractured colors, but the warmth didn't reach him. He could feel their eyes on the back of his neck. Neighbors, old friends, men who'd once brought their cars to his shop. People who now looked at him as if he were something broken. When the pastor began the sermon, George tried to focus on the words, but his mind drifted. He kept replaying the last few weeks like a bad dream. The rain, the trash, the shelter. He'd survived worse, but never this kind of humiliation. This quiet, collective cruelty that strips a man of dignity. Then he heard the voice that made his jaw tighten. David's voice. He hadn't realized his son was there until the end of the service, when David stood near the church steps outside, surrounded by a cluster of familiar faces. He was laughing, loudly, performatively, and as George stepped into the light, David's voice lifted just enough to carry. "I love my father. I really do," he said, shaking his head with practiced sadness. "But he's not well. Since Mom died, he's been confused, paranoid even. It's heartbreaking to watch." The crowd murmured in sympathy, every sound another blade sliding between George's ribs. He stopped a few paces away, his cane planted firmly in the dirt. "Paranoid?" George asked quietly. David turned, all fake surprise. "Dad, I didn't see you there." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "We were just talking about how much we're praying for you." Linda, standing beside him, smirked. "Yes, George, we're all worried. Everyone's heard how difficult things have been for you." Her tone dripped with false pity. "You should really think about professional help. Someone who understands these episodes." A few people nodded. Someone muttered, "Poor man." George's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the pulse in his temples, the heat crawling up his neck. "You think I'm crazy?" he asked, voice trembling but clear. "You throw me out of my house, destroy your mother's memories, and now you stand here, lying, to make yourselves look better?" The group went quiet, but not out of guilt. They were just uncomfortable, afraid of proximity to disgrace. David raised a calming hand, the picture of composure. "See?" he said softly to them. "He gets worked up. This is what I mean." Linda nodded, feigning concern. "It's sad. Really." George's breathing grew uneven. He wanted to shout, to call them out for the frauds they were, but the words felt trapped behind years of restraint. He took one step forward, but before he could speak again, A familiar voice cut through the murmurs. Enough. Anna was there, his sister, her eyes blazing. She walked straight to his side, glaring at David. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Turning your father into a spectacle for these people? David's jaw twitched, his confident facade faltering for a split second. Aunt Anna, you don't understand. I understand plenty, she snapped. I understand that if George doesn't fight back soon, your lies will become truth. The crowd shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't seen. David muttered something under his breath and turned away, leading Linda toward their car. Anna turned to George, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You hear me, George. Fight back before you're erased, before they rewrite who you are. George didn't answer. He just stood there, the sun beating down, the congregation slowly dispersing like vultures after a meal. His fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles went white, the skin trembling over bone. He looked at the church doors, the same ones he'd walked through with pride for decades, and for the first time, he didn't feel welcome there. He didn't feel like he belonged anywhere. But beneath the humiliation, beneath the shame, something cold and solid began to take shape. He exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the road where David's car disappeared. His voice, when it came, was almost too quiet to hear. I will. The envelope came on a Tuesday morning, tucked neatly into the stack of bills and charity flyers Sarah had left on the kitchen counter. At first, George thought it was just another bank statement, something routine, something harmless. But when he saw the county seal in the corner and the word eviction printed in bold across the top, the air in his lungs seemed to vanish. He unfolded the letter with shaking hands, each line burning deeper than the last. The house, the one he built, the one he bled for, was no longer his. According to the document, it belonged entirely to David Miller, his own son. The letter stated that George had already transferred the deed months earlier, and now, by law, he had no right to occupy the property. His vision blurred. For a moment, the room tilted. He sat down heavily, gripping the edge of the table. Sarah heard the sound of paper crumpling and hurried in from the hallway. Dad, what's wrong? George couldn't find the words. He just handed her the envelope. Sarah skimmed it once, then again, her face drained of color. No, she said under her breath. No, this can't be right. Her voice began to rise. You never signed this. You told me you refused. George nodded slowly, eyes glassy. I did. I never touched those papers. Sarah pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to think. We're going to fix this. We'll get a lawyer. She didn't finish the sentence. She was already reaching for her phone. 2 hours later, they sat in a dimly lit office that smelled faintly of paper and desperation. The lawyer, a thin man in his 50s with weary eyes, scanned the documents silently. The only sound was the faint tick of the wall clock and George's labored breathing. Finally, the man leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Mr. Miller, he said carefully, I've seen this before. Your son didn't just file for a transfer. He forged your signature. George blinked. Forged? Yes. The lawyer slid the papers closer, pointing to a shaky scrawl on the bottom line. This is meant to be yours, but look, your actual signature from past records is clean, controlled. This one's uneven, rushed. I can prove it's falsified, but the process will take time. George stared at the imitation of his own name, that false, crooked version of himself. The betrayal wasn't just emotional now. It was on paper, signed and sealed. He'd been erased legally, as though he were already gone. Sarah's face flushed with anger. He forged our father's name. He stole his house. That's a crime. He's going to pay for this. The lawyer hesitated. Technically, yes, but proving intent can be difficult. You'll need evidence, witnesses, financial records. It's possible, but it'll be a long fight. Sarah's hand slammed the table. Then we fight. The lawyer nodded slowly, then turned to George. Sir, you need to be prepared. This will get ugly. Family cases always do. George didn't answer right away. He was staring at the signature again, the trembling imitation of his life's mark. His voice, when it came, was quiet but heavy. He took my name, he murmured, even my name. On the drive home, Sarah gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. He doesn't get away with this, Dad, not after everything he's done. George looked out the window, his reflection pale against the glass. I raised him better, he said softly. Or maybe I thought I did. When they got home, Anna was waiting at the kitchen table, her glasses perched low on her nose, surrounded by piles of folders and old papers. She'd gone digging through every box she had: birth certificates, property tax records, mortgage statements from decades ago. I kept copies, she said firmly. You think I trusted David not to pull something like this? Not after how he's been. Sarah dropped her purse onto the counter. Good, we'll need everything we can get. George sat down slowly, the weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders. He rubbed his temples, feeling the dull throb of his pulse. For the first time, he realized just how deep this betrayal went. It wasn't just greed, it was annihilation. David hadn't just taken his home, he'd tried to erase his father's existence entirely, but somewhere beneath the humiliation, something colder began to stir, a kind of grim clarity. Dad, Sarah said quietly, her voice gentler now, we'll fix this, okay? He nodded, eyes still on the documents spread before him. No, he said, we'll fight this. Sarah looked at him, startled by the steel in his tone. He folded the eviction notice neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and set it on the table like a declaration of war. His voice was steady now, measured, unshakable. He started this, George said, but I'll finish it. Sleep had become a stranger. Each night, George lay awake on the small couch in Sarah's living room, the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock his only company. Shadows crawled along the ceiling like memories he couldn't shake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw David, not as the man who'd thrown him out, but as the boy he once was. He saw him at 7 years old, running down the cracked driveway, the afternoon sun catching in his hair as he wobbled on the small red bicycle George had bought secondhand. "Don't let go, Dad!" he'd shouted, laughing, terrified and thrilled all at once. George had pretended to hold on longer than he really did, smiling as his son pedaled farther than he ever had before. That was the moment he'd felt proudest, watching his boy ride away, steady and sure, not knowing that years later he'd keep riding, farther and farther from everything that mattered. George turned over on the couch, staring at the framed photos on Sarah's wall. David as a teenager, baseball glove, crooked grin, a world still soft around the edges. What had gone wrong? Where had he failed him? The question dug into his chest, like a thorn he couldn't pull free. He had worked too much, maybe, given too little discipline, too much forgiveness. He'd mistaken comfort for love, and now that love had curdled into greed. His throat tightened as he whispered into the dark, "I made him this way." The floor creaked, and a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Anna, her hair wrapped in a scarf, eyes heavy but alert. She carried 2 mugs of tea, one in each hand. "Can't sleep again?" she asked softly, setting one down beside him. George forced a smile. Old habits. The mind doesn't turn off when it's full of ghosts. She sat beside him, wrapping her hands around the mug. "You're blaming yourself again, aren't you?" He didn't answer, but the silence was enough. Anna sighed, shaking her head. "George, you gave that boy everything you had. You broke your back to give him a life you never had. This is his sin, not yours." Her words were gentle, but they struck deep. He wanted to believe them, but guilt had a way of rewriting truth. Maybe if I'd been tougher, if I hadn't spoiled him after his mother died. His voice faltered. Maybe he wouldn't have turned out like this. Anna looked at him, her eyes softening. You're still trying to fix him. You can't. Some people choose their path, no matter how good their start was. He rubbed his chest then, a slow, deliberate motion, but the ache didn't fade. It was a dull pressure beneath his ribs, one that had been coming and going since the eviction. This time, it lingered longer than usual. Anna noticed. George, you okay? He tried to wave it off. Just heartburn, I'll be fine. But she didn't believe him. She grabbed her phone before he could stop her. I'm calling Dr. Green. Within the hour, Dr. Green's calm voice filled the small living room, his medical bag open on the table. He examined George carefully, his expression growing more serious as he listened to the stethoscope. You're lucky this wasn't worse, he said, pulling the instrument from his ears. Your heart's under too much strain. The stress, the lack of sleep, it's all adding up. The next attack could be fatal, George. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Anna gasped quietly, her hand covering her mouth. Fatal? George sat up straighter, the dim lamplight catching the resolve in his tired eyes. So be it, he whispered. Dr. Green frowned. Don't say that. You need rest. You need peace. But George wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were distant, fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the little house. His heart might have been weak, but his purpose was solidifying, sharp, immovable. If death was waiting, then it would wait its turn. Anna reached for his hand, but he didn't move. He stared out the window into the dark, where the night was thick and endless, and said quietly, Not before I finish what he started. The world has a cruel way of flaunting the success of those who don't deserve it. For George Miller, it came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of quiet day that mocks you with its peace. He had just stepped out of the pharmacy, his small brown paper bag of medication clutched in one hand, when the gleam of sunlight on polished chrome caught his eye. Across the street, in front of a luxury dealership, stood David, his son, dressed sharp, confident, grinning like he'd conquered the world. Linda was there too, perched beside him in a sleek red coat that looked far too expensive for anyone earning an honest living. George froze, half hidden by a row of parked cars. He watched as David circled a brand new SUV, jet black, spotless, the kind of car that screamed money. A salesman handed him the keys with both hands, the way people treat men who sign without looking at the price. David took them casually, like it was nothing. Linda leaned close, her laughter floating across the lot. You finally did it, didn't you? David smirked, slipping on his sunglasses. Yeah, he said, loud enough for George to hear even across the street. All it took was cutting off the dead weight. Free house, no mortgage, no baggage. Dead weight? The words burned in George's ears. He felt his chest tighten, a dull ache that reminded him of Dr. Green's warning. But he didn't move. He couldn't. Linda ran her hand along the hood of the car. You did what had to be done. Your father was holding you back. Now look at you, finally living like you deserve. David chuckled, flipping open the driver's door. I told you, baby. You can't build an empire dragging around a man stuck in the past. For a moment, George's vision blurred, not from the sunlight, but from the rage crawling up his spine. The world around him seemed to fade, his son's voice echoing louder than the traffic, louder than the city itself. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the small recorder on his phone. His hand trembled, but his mind was sharp. He pressed record. Cheers to freedom, David said, sliding into the leather seat. Best investment I ever made. Linda laughed again, kissing him on the cheek. And to think everyone pitied you. You turned it into profit. George's thumb stopped shaking. He captured every word, every smug syllable that redefined what kind of man his son truly was. When David started the engine, The SUV purred like arrogance made flesh. As the car rolled away, George stood there, the cold wind biting through his jacket. He played the recording once, just to hear it again, to remind himself this wasn't a nightmare. His voice didn't shake this time. "Got you," he muttered. That evening, he sat at Sarah's dining table. She was sorting through mail when he placed the phone in front of her and pressed play. At first, she frowned, confused. Then came the words, the bragging, the laughter, the casual cruelty. When it ended, she stared at her father, disbelief written across her face. "He said that? Free house?" George nodded once. "You heard him." Sarah's hands trembled. "He's not even hiding it anymore. He thinks he's untouchable." From the living room, Anna entered quietly, a dish towel still in her hands. "What's that?" Sarah handed her the phone, still replaying the recording. Anna's eyes widened as the voices filled the room. When it ended, she looked at George, her expression firm. "Use it," she said simply. "Use his arrogance against him. Men like David always hang themselves with their own rope." George leaned back in his chair, the lines in his face deepened by exhaustion and fury. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he picked up the phone, replayed the last few seconds. David's laughter, Linda's praise, and smiled, but not kindly. "I will," he said, his voice low and steady, the tremor gone. "He took everything from me. Now I'll take everything that matters to him." Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, soft and distant, but growing closer, like the echo of something inevitable. By the time Sarah suggested bringing in a detective, George had already begun to lose faith that anyone in authority would care. Lawyers, clerks, neighbors, they all saw an old man beaten down by family drama, not a victim of a crime. But Sarah wouldn't let it go. "You can't fight this alone, Dad," she said, determination burning in her eyes. "You need someone who knows how to find truth in lies." That's how Detective Michael Harris entered their lives. They met him in a small cafe on the edge of town, a quiet, unremarkable place where the hum of espresso machines could drown out any conversation. Harris didn't look like the detectives George had seen on television. No trench coat, no bravado. Just a man in his late 40s with tired eyes, a calm presence, and a notepad that looked well worn from years of disappointment and persistence. When George shook his hand, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Respect. Harris looked him in the eye, firm and steady. "Sarah told me a little about what happened," he said, voice measured. "You believe your son forged your signature to take your property?" George hesitated before nodding. "Believe it? No, I know it." Sarah slid a folder across the table. Documents Anna had dug out from boxes and old filing cabinets, proof of ownership, notarized forms, letters from the mortgage company. Harris flipped through them silently, his brow furrowing as his pen moved quickly across his notebook. Every so often, he stopped to study a detail, his finger tracing a line of ink or a date that didn't match. After several minutes, he looked up. "These two signatures," he said, laying the forged deed beside an older document. "See the G. The loops are different. Yours closes neatly. This one's open. Same with the M. Yours always has a tail at the end. Whoever did this tried to imitate your handwriting, but didn't understand your rhythm." George leaned forward, heart thudding. "So, you're saying it is forged?" Harris nodded slowly. "Almost certainly, but proving it legally will take more than observation. We'll need a handwriting expert, sworn statements, possibly even financial tracing if money exchanged hands during the transfer." He looked at George, his tone softening. "You up for that fight?" George's hands trembled on the edge of the table. "I've lost everything, Detective. What else do I have left to lose?" The detective studied him quietly before closing the folder. "Then we'll start here," he said. "This is your foundation." Sarah exhaled deeply, relief and fear mixing in equal measure. "What happens next?" Harris leaned back, thinking. I'll pull the deed record from the county archives. If your son filed it electronically, there will be digital logs, timestamps, IP addresses, everything. If it's paper, we'll find the notary who signed off on it. Either way, someone helped him do this. And people always leave footprints when they think they're untouchable. For the first time in weeks, George felt a flicker of warmth in his chest. Not joy, but something close. Hope, cautious and unfamiliar. Anna arrived midway through the meeting, breathless from hurrying. When Harris introduced himself, she immediately began unpacking a manila envelope full of older records. I've kept every bill, every tax receipt, every letter from the bank since 1985, she said proudly. He can try to erase my brother, but not my paperwork. Harris smiled faintly. You're making my job easy. He spread the documents across the table, creating a mosaic of George's life. Decades of honest work, of signatures that told the story of a man who'd always done things by the book. This one, Harris said, pointing to a faded copy of a 1999 mortgage renewal, matches perfectly with your handwriting. The new deed doesn't. That's our first lead. Anna looked to George, eyes shining. You see? We've got him. We've got him, George. George didn't answer right away. He stared at the evidence, at his name scrawled neatly in ink from years gone by, and then at the forgery, cold, mechanical, soulless. It was strange how something as small as a signature could carry so much weight, how it could define truth or destroy it. Harris closed his notebook and slid it into his coat pocket. I'll be in touch within a week, but I'll tell you this much, Mr. Miller. Your son's arrogance is your greatest weapon. Men like him make mistakes because they think the world will never question them. All you have to do is let me follow the cracks. As Harris stood to leave, George's hand shot out, gripping his arm. Detective, he said quietly, if you find what I think you will, I want to be the one to face him. Harris met his gaze evenly. You will, but not yet. The detective walked out into the fading daylight, leaving George, Sarah, and Anna sitting in silence. For the first time, the silence didn't feel hollow. It felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. George looked down at the forged deed one last time, the false version of his own name staring back at him. The anger inside him had settled into something cleaner, sharper. He folded the paper carefully, sliding it into his jacket pocket as he spoke, his voice steady and low. It's time, he said. He's had his turn. Now it's mine. Detective Harris worked quietly, methodically, the kind of man who didn't announce when he was close to something. George hadn't heard from him for nearly 2 weeks, long enough for doubt to creep back in. Then, one evening, the phone rang. Mr. Miller, Harris said, his tone low but charged with purpose. I think it's time we talked. They met the next morning in Harris's small office downtown. The walls were lined with case files and photographs, the blinds half drawn against the pale light. A single fan rotated lazily overhead, stirring the scent of stale coffee and paper. George sat in the same chair as before, his cane propped beside him, while Sarah and Anna flanked him like anchors, holding him steady. Harris spread a thick folder across the desk. You were right about your son, he said, his eyes meeting George's. But this goes deeper than forgery. George's stomach tightened. How deep? Harris flipped open the folder. Inside were pages of printed emails, bank statements, and property records. David's been moving money between accounts, Harris explained. He's running what looks like a small-scale investment scam, promising returns to local contractors and retirees, taking their funds and using the money to pay off other debts, or finance his lifestyle. Sarah leaned forward, eyes wide. You mean he's stealing from people? Essentially, yes, Harris said. It's classic misappropriation. He's covering it up with doctored invoices and fake receipts, and your daughter-in-law, Linda, is helping him. Her name shows up as a witness on several fraudulent contracts, It's not just moral complicity, it's legal. The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the fan. George stared at the document spread before him, his pulse pounding in his ears. Each page was another betrayal, another layer of filth wrapped around his son's name. He had known David was selfish, entitled. But this was a rot that had grown unseen, festering in the dark. Harris continued, his voice steady but grim. He's already facing multiple unpaid debts, car loans, private investments, a failed property flip. Without the house in his name, he'd be bankrupt by now. That forgery wasn't just greed, Mr. Miller. It was survival. George's throat tightened. He used my home to keep his empire alive. Exactly, Harris said. He needed a legitimate asset to keep the banks off his back. Once he transferred the deed, he used it as collateral to secure new lines of credit. That's how he bought the SUV, remodeled the house, and kept up appearances. Sarah slumped back in her chair, her hand over her mouth. Oh my God. Harris hesitated, studying her. I'm sorry, Miss Miller. I know this is hard to hear. She shook her head, eyes glistening. He's still my brother, she whispered. I can't just... She stopped, unable to finish. Anna's voice cut through, sharp and unwavering. He chose this path, Sarah. Sarah turned to her aunt, anger and grief twisting together. You think it's that simple? He's family. Anna's expression softened only slightly. Family doesn't excuse evil. It just makes it hurt more. George sat silently through their exchange, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The papers before him blurred as memories intruded. David's graduation, his wedding, the day he'd first brought Linda home and introduced her as the one. He had been proud then. So proud. He felt a burning shame rise up his chest. I gave him everything, he said quietly, and he used it all to build a lie. Harris nodded. That's often how it starts. People think they're just bending rules to get ahead. But your son, he's past that. The forgery ties into the financial fraud. If we can link those together, we'll have leverage in court. George looked up. You mean we can prove it? Yes, Harris replied. But it'll take time. I'll need you to stay patient, stay calm, and most importantly, stay alive through this. You're the key witness. Without you, this case falls apart. The words landed heavily. George thought of Dr. Green's warning, of his failing heart and sleepless nights. The idea that his health could determine whether justice was done was almost too much to bear. Sarah reached for his hand. Dad, we'll get through this. Together. He didn't speak. His gaze stayed fixed on the folder, page after page of evidence against the boy he'd once carried on his shoulders. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to cry or to rage, so instead, he did neither. His face hardened, settling into something cold and certain. Detective, he said at last, voice steady, what's our next move? Harris closed the file and leaned forward. You let me build the case. You keep collecting anything he sends you, messages, calls, anything suspicious. When the time's right, we'll strike, quietly, legally, and when we do, there won't be any coming back for him. George nodded slowly. Good. I don't want revenge anymore, he said, his tone firm but quiet. I want the truth, and I want him to face it. Harris stood, extending his hand again. Then we're in agreement. George shook it, the grip strong, unflinching. But as he rose from the chair, the weight of what he'd just seen lingered like a stone in his chest. His son wasn't just a liar, he was a criminal, a fraud, and worse, he'd done it all under the family name. Outside the office, the sky was darkening, clouds gathering low and heavy. Anna walked beside him in silence while Sarah lingered behind, still reeling. George paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the dim horizon. The wind carried the faint scent of rain. He took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. his voice barely more than a whisper. Then it's war. The plan wasn't built in anger. It was built in silence. In the long, sleepless nights, when George Miller sat alone at the kitchen table, papers spread around him like the wreckage of a life stolen piece by piece. Every line, every number on the bank statements meant something now. Every recording, every document, every timestamp was a weapon. Detective Harris had told him to move carefully. "Patience is everything," he'd said. "If you go too early, he walks free. If we wait, we bury him." So George waited. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Day after day, he organized the evidence with meticulous focus. He had the recording of David bragging about his free house. He had screenshots of social media posts flaunting renovations paid for with other people's money. And, thanks to Harris, he now had access to a trail of suspicious transactions, payments moving from David's company accounts into personal ones, disguised as consulting fees. Each discovery made his stomach turn, but it also strengthened his resolve. Anna helped him sort the files, her sharp mind cutting through confusion where his eyes blurred from fatigue. "You sure you're up for this?" she'd asked one night as she stacked folders into neat piles. George looked up from his chair, his face pale but steady. "I wasn't up for losing everything. I'll be up for this." Harris called often, checking in with updates, reminding George to stay in the shadows. "He doesn't know you're coming," the detective said during one call. "Don't give him reason to suspect it. Let him think he's still untouchable." That chance came sooner than expected. David and Linda announced a celebration online, a grand housewarming party at the very home they'd stolen. The invitation, dripping with arrogance, circulated through the neighborhood. New beginnings deserve a toast. Sarah saw it first, her voice shaking when she read it aloud. "He's having a party in your house, inviting the same people who watched him throw you out." Anna's hands clenched into fists. "He wants to humiliate you again." George sat back in his chair, expression unreadable. "Let him," he said quietly. "I'll go." Sarah froze. "You can't be serious. He'll make a scene." But George just smiled, the kind of slow, knowing smile that unnerved even those who loved him most. "He's already made the scene. I'm just the part he didn't cast." The night of the party came warm and loud. The Miller house, his house, was lit up like a monument to greed. Expensive cars lined the driveway, music spilled from the open doors, and laughter floated out into the night air. George walked up the path slowly, his cane tapping against the concrete, every step deliberate. The guests noticed him before David did. Conversation stumbled, smiles froze, whispers rippled through the crowd. "Is that George?" someone murmured. "He's got nerve showing up here." George met their eyes, one by one, and kept walking. The air smelled of perfume and catered food, but beneath it, he could still sense the ghosts of his old life, Martha's flowers, the faint oil scent from his hands that used to cling to the walls. David spotted him near the doorway, glass in hand, face tightening with irritation. "Dad," he said sharply, lowering his voice. "What are you doing here?" "Came to see what you've done with the place," George said evenly. "After all, I built it." A few nearby guests shifted awkwardly, pretending not to listen. Linda appeared beside David, her smile tight and artificial. "This is really not the time, George." George's gaze swept across the glittering room, the expensive furniture, the chandeliers, the artificial laughter. "No," he said quietly. "It's exactly the time." He didn't stay long. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to sour the air, to make every glass clink sound like a warning. The whispers grew louder as he moved from room to room, his eyes scanning the details. The things David thought he owned, the people he thought respected him. By the time George stepped outside, the laughter inside had thinned. From the corner of the porch, he turned back toward the house. Through the window, he saw Linda watching him, her face pale, her posture stiff. For the first time, she didn't look smug. She looked afraid. She could feel it. The shift. The quiet before the reckoning. George adjusted his coat, the faintest smirk crossing his lips. "You feel it too, don't you?" he murmured to himself. "The storm's coming." Down the street, a car idled, the faint outline of Harris visible through the windshield, observing from a distance, making sure the plan stayed clean. George gave a small nod in the detective's direction before turning away. The night air was cool against his face as he walked, each breath measured, steady. The humiliation of the past months still clung to him, but beneath it all was something sharper now, control. He finally had it back. Behind him, the lights of the stolen house glowed bright against the darkness, and inside, Linda's uneasy stare followed him until he vanished into the shadows. George didn't look back again. He didn't need to. He already knew. Every empire built on deceit eventually collapses, and his son's would be no different. It was late afternoon when George decided there would be no more waiting. The evidence Harris had gathered was growing by the day, but George needed to look his son in the eye, to see what kind of man he'd really become. No courts, no lawyers, just father and son. He drove slowly down the street that used to be his home, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The familiar maple trees lining the road swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets of the past. The house came into view, a hollow monument to everything he'd lost. Fresh paint, new fixtures, trimmed hedges. But beneath all the polish, George could still feel the soul of the place. Martha's rose bushes by the porch were gone, replaced by sterile landscaping stones. He parked at the curb and stepped out, his cane tapping against the pavement as he made his way to the door. When David opened it, surprise flickered across his face, then quickly turned to irritation. "What the hell are you doing here?" George stood on the threshold, the weight of years between them pressing down like gravity. "We need to talk," he said evenly. David crossed his arms, blocking the entrance. "Talk about what? You have no business being here, old man." George's eyes swept the room behind him, his old living room, rearranged beyond recognition. "You've done a lot with the place," he said quietly. "Looks different." David smirked. "It's called improvement. You wouldn't understand." Something sharp and cold stirred in George's chest. "Improvement?" he repeated. "You tore out everything that had meaning, everything your mother loved, everything I built with my hands." David laughed under his breath, the sound bitter. "You built? Please. You were a glorified mechanic who never knew when to quit. You got lucky with a mortgage and thought it made you a king." George met his son's eyes steadily. "I built this life you're wasting." For a moment, silence stretched between them, taut and dangerous. Then David stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "You think you can walk in here and lecture me? You're nothing now. No house, no savings, no power. You're just a bitter old man clinging to the past." George didn't flinch. "Maybe, but I'm still your father." David's lips curled into a sneer. "That title stopped meaning anything the night you refused to help me. You had your chance to make things right, and you chose pride. So don't talk to me about family. You lost that privilege." From deeper inside the house, Linda's voice floated out, sharp and annoyed. "David, who is it?" She appeared a moment later, her heels clicking against the new tile. When she saw George, her expression shifted from surprise to disdain. "Oh, it's you." George gave her a cold nod. "I see you're still enjoying the spoils." Linda crossed her arms. "I'm enjoying what David earned." George let out a humorless chuckle. "Earned? You mean what he forged, stole, and flaunted?" David's voice rose. "You'd better watch what you say. I could sue you for slander." George stepped forward until they were almost nose to nose. You'd need to prove you're innocent first. David's composure cracked, his voice trembling with anger. You think anyone will believe you? You're old, broke, and desperate. I'll bury you in court, Dad. I'll make sure what's left of your reputation is dust. George stared at him for a long moment, his breathing calm despite the tremor in his chest. Then he said quietly, You've already done that, son. Linda scoffed, taking David's arm. He's not worth it. Let him bark. He's got nothing left. But David wasn't done. You want to go to war with me? Fine. You'll lose. I have the money, the lawyers, the property. You have nothing but memories. George's voice lowered, steady as stone. You've mistaken silence for weakness. You think because I walked away I gave up, but you've built this whole empire on lies, and lies don't hold forever. David's laugh was brittle, forced. You talk like you're some kind of avenger. You can't touch me, old man. You never could. George tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. You're right. I can't touch what doesn't exist. The words landed harder than a slap. For the first time, David's confidence faltered. His eyes darted to Linda, who shifted uncomfortably. What the hell's that supposed to mean? David demanded. George leaned on his cane, his voice low but laced with quiet certainty. You're standing in a house that isn't yours, living a life you didn't earn. Everything around you is borrowed, bought with deceit, and soon, everyone will know. David's face flushed red. You're bluffing. Am I? George asked softly. You'll find out soon enough. For a long, heavy moment, they stared at each other, father and son, mirror images divided by time and betrayal. Then Linda tugged David's arm. He's wasting your time. Let him go before he causes another scene. But George wasn't finished. He stepped back toward the doorway, his gaze sweeping the room one last time. You think this house is your crown, he said, but it's your cage, David, and soon the walls will close in. David followed him onto the porch, anger trembling just beneath his voice. You can't touch me. Whatever fantasy you're building in your head, it ends here. George turned, eyes burning with a cold, quiet fire. No, he said. It begins here. Linda shifted nervously behind David. Her intuition, sharp as ever, caught what her husband missed. The certainty in George's tone, the steady resolve of a man who'd stopped fearing loss. For the first time, she looked uneasy. George adjusted his coat, meeting David's glare one last time. Your empire, he said calmly, will crumble. He descended the steps slowly, the sound of his cane tapping against the concrete like a ticking clock. Behind him, the front door slammed shut, but the echo lingered, loud, heavy, final. David thought he'd just silenced an old man. But George knew better. The war had just gone public. The storm hadn't broken yet, but it was coming. The clouds gathered heavy and low over the horizon, a dark smear across the afternoon sky. George could feel the pressure of it deep in his chest, that same slow tightening he'd been fighting for weeks. He sat at Anna's kitchen table, papers scattered between them, records, receipts, printed emails, evidence of every lie David had told. But the triumph he once felt while building the case was gone, replaced now by fatigue so deep it trembled in his bones. Anna watched him quietly, her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. You're not sleeping, she said finally. You've lost weight. Look at yourself, George. He didn't lift his eyes. I'm fine. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. You're not. You're killing yourself over this. George's jaw tightened. He already tried to kill me in every other way. What's left? Anna's voice rose, sharp and breaking. Revenge will eat what's left of you. Don't you see that? You think you're fighting him, but really, you're just feeding him. Every sleepless night, every panic, every angry word, you're giving him what he wants. He finally looked up, eyes dull but steady. He already devoured me, Anna. The silence that followed was heavy. The clock ticked on the wall, each second stretching thin between them. She blinked fast, fighting back tears. You're not the same man who used to fix cars until midnight and still come home smiling. You used to laugh, George. You used to have light. That was before my son turned my life into ash, he said softly. You don't come back from that. The sound of a car outside interrupted them. Sarah's. She came in fast, her coat half-buttoned, her eyes red from crying. I just came from David's, she said, voice trembling. He's furious, Dad. He said you're spreading lies about him, that you've turned people against him. He threatened to sue you again. George leaned back, exhausted. Let him. Dad, please, Sarah's voice cracked. This has gone too far. You can't keep doing this. You're both destroying each other. Anna stood, her frustration boiling over. Your brother destroyed this family the moment he forged that signature. Don't stand here defending him. I'm not defending him, Sarah cried, tears spilling freely now. I'm begging both of you to stop. He's still my brother, and you're my father. I can't watch this anymore. George rose from his chair, slow and deliberate, leaning on his cane for balance. You can walk away if you need to, Sarah, he said quietly. But I can't. Not until the truth is seen. His voice was calm, but beneath it ran the low hum of something fierce and unrelenting. Sarah covered her face with her hands, sobbing silently, and Anna moved to her side, pulling her into an embrace. The knock at the door startled them. It was Dr. Green, still in his white coat, the lines of worry etched deep across his face. I came as soon as I heard, he said, glancing at George. You're pushing yourself too hard again. George tried to deflect. I'm fine, doctor. Green wasn't buying it. You're not fine. Your heart can't handle this kind of stress. The last test showed severe strain. Another attack, and it could be fatal. Anna looked horrified. You see, George, he's warning you. You're gambling with your life. But George only smiled faintly, a sad, distant smile that didn't reach his eyes. It's already been gambled, Anna. I'm just making sure it counts for something. Dr. Green's tone softened. You need to let go before it consumes you completely. Justice doesn't mean much if you're not around to see it. George took a slow breath, looking out the window at the sky, darkening over the trees. If it kills me, so be it, he said, but I won't die on my knees. The doctor exhaled heavily, defeated. Sarah turned away, unable to listen anymore. Anna pressed her hand against her brother's shoulder, her voice trembling. Then I pray you find peace before the storm finds you. He looked at her, and for the first time, there was something in his eyes that resembled both love and finality. The storm's already here, he murmured. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, low, deep, inevitable. It was the sound of everything coming to a head, of a reckoning that could no longer be stopped. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood polish and nerves. George Miller sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded tightly on the smooth surface, the faint tremor in them visible only to those who looked close enough. It was the first time he'd seen David in weeks. His son sat across the aisle, sharp suit, slicked hair, jaw tight enough to crack. He looked like a man trying to convince the world he was in control, but his eyes, darting, restless, told another story. Linda sat beside him, her hands clasped together, knuckles white. The confident smirk she once wore in every public space was gone. In its place was something brittle, uncertain. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The gavel struck once, echoing like thunder. The sound seemed to travel straight through George's chest. Case number 3275, the clerk announced. Miller versus Miller. Allegations of deed forgery and financial fraud. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The case had become small-town spectacle. Old neighbors, old co-workers, even members of their church, all curious enough to watch the fall of the Miller family play out like theater. George felt their eyes on him, but he didn't look back. He was done with shame. His attorney, a measured man named Russell Payne, stood tall and composed as he addressed the bench. Your Honor, this is a case of calculated betrayal, a father stripped of his home by the very son he raised. The evidence will show that Mr. David Miller forged his father's signature on the deed transfer and used that forgery to secure loans and remodel the property for personal gain. David shifted in his chair, jaw tightening. His own lawyer, a smooth-talking man with an expensive watch, rose immediately. Your Honor, my client categorically denies these allegations. This is nothing more than a bitter old man's attempt to destroy his son's success out of jealousy and spite. A low hum moved through the audience. Sarah sat behind George, clutching Anna's hand. Both women's faces were pale, but their eyes were sharp, alert, unblinking. Russell continued, spreading several documents across the table. Exhibit A, Your Honor, Mr. George Miller's original signature from mortgage records spanning over 20 years. Exhibit B, the disputed deed transfer filed by the defendant. You'll note distinct inconsistencies, specifically in the curvature of the letter G and the slant of the terminal strokes. The judge leaned forward, studying the papers through her glasses. I see. And you have verification? Russell nodded. A certified handwriting expert has reviewed both sets of documents. Their statement confirms the signature on the transfer is indeed a forgery. Linda's hand flew to her mouth. David's eyes flicked toward her, cold and sharp. Don't, he hissed under his breath. Don't react. But her composure was slipping. Her gaze darted toward the gallery, toward the people whispering, pointing. The pressure of exposure pressed down like heat. Russell went on, his tone calm but relentless. Additionally, Your Honor, Detective Michael Harris, who has been assisting in the investigation, has traced several financial transfers made immediately following the filing of this fraudulent deed. These transfers were directed to the defendant's private accounts. David's lawyer stood abruptly. Objection! This detective's testimony is speculative. Overruled, the judge said coolly. Proceed, Mr. Agent Payne. George watched quietly as Harris took the stand. The detective's voice was steady, professional, carrying the weight of fact. He outlined the trail, each transaction, each false receipt, each deposit made under Linda's name. David's lawyer tried to interrupt twice, but Harris never wavered. In my professional opinion, he concluded, this was not an accident or misunderstanding. It was deliberate. The words hung in the air, thick and final. David leaned forward, whispering something harsh to his lawyer, his composure cracking at the edges. His foot tapped under the table, fast, impatient. The mask of confidence was slipping, piece by piece. George studied him quietly. His son, the same boy he once taught to change a tire, to shake hands firmly, to never lie. Now sitting across from him, sweating under the weight of his own deceit. The judge turned to David's side. Mr. Miller, do you have a response to these allegations? David stood slowly, adjusting his tie. His expression caught somewhere between arrogance and panic. Yes, Your Honor, I do. His voice trembled on the first word, but steadied with effort. My father doesn't know what he's talking about. He's confused. He's 70, on medication, and his memory isn't what it used to be. He gestured toward the documents. This is all a misunderstanding, twisted by resentment. Russell stood again. Your Honor, the defendant's argument is emotional deflection, not evidence. The judge raised a hand. Enough. I'll review all material submissions before rendering any ruling. This hearing is adjourned pending further documentation. The gavel came down with a heavy crack. The sound jolted through the courtroom. As people began to rise, the whispers grew louder, some sympathetic, some scornful. George remained seated for a moment longer, staring straight ahead. No victory yet, but for the first time, His son had been cornered, not by rage, but by truth. David stormed towards the exit, his movements sharp, unsteady. "You'll regret this," he spat under his breath as he passed George's table. George looked up at him calmly. "You already do." Linda lingered at the door, her face pale. She glanced back once, meeting George's eyes. For the briefest second, guilt flickered there. Then she turned away. Outside, thunder cracked over the courthouse, shaking the windows. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, drowning out the murmurs of the departing crowd. George stepped into it without an umbrella, the rain running cold down his face. Sarah hurried to cover him with her coat, but he waved her off gently. His voice was quiet, resolute. "This isn't the storm, sweetheart," he said. "It's just the first drop." The story hit the local paper on a gray Tuesday morning. A bold headline stretched across the front page like a wound. "Veteran vs. Son, Family Feud Sparks Fraud Case." George Miller's name, once associated with the town's trusted mechanic, a quiet man who fixed cars and waved at everyone, was now printed in thick black letters under the photo of the courthouse. The article laid everything bare: the allegations of forgery, the courtroom confrontation, the whispers of financial misconduct. It was all there. By noon, the story was everywhere. The grocery store checkout line, the post office, even the church bulletin board. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to George in months suddenly had opinions again. Some whispered that he'd finally snapped under the weight of grief and old age. Others said it was about time someone exposed what David had done. The town was divided. In the diner on Main Street, two men argued over coffee and eggs. "Poor old guy's losing it," one muttered, shaking his head. "His son's the one holding everything together." The other snorted. "Holding it together with stolen money, you mean? I heard from Pete at the bank. David's been juggling loans for years." Rumors multiplied faster than truth could catch them. By evening, the radio had picked up the story. The headline was reshaped for drama, for clicks. "War hero claims son stole family home." George didn't listen to the broadcast. He sat in Anna's kitchen, the paper folded neatly beside him, the black ink still fresh under his fingertips. His tea had gone cold. The humiliation should have stung, but instead, something else had taken its place. Resolve. Sarah burst in just after sunset, cheeks flushed from the wind, a stack of flyers in her hands. "They're running their mouths all over town," she said, slamming the stack down, "but I'm not letting him control the story." George looked up slowly. "What do you mean?" "I spoke to the journalist who wrote the piece," she said, voice trembling but firm. "I told him about you, who you really are, about Mom, about the nights you worked 3 jobs just to keep us fed. I told him this isn't about bitterness. It's about justice." Anna's eyes widened. "Sarah, you didn't." "I did," she said fiercely. "They're going to run a follow-up tomorrow. This time, people will see the truth." Across town, David's phone buzzed non-stop. He sat at the head of his dining table, the same table that had once belonged to his parents, scrolling through the flood of comments online, some sympathetic, some venomous. His face twisted as he read. "Can't believe a son would do that. He's just another rich fraud living off someone else's work. I used to respect that family." Each line chipped away at the carefully built image he'd crafted. He threw his phone onto the table, the sound sharp against the polished wood. "This is out of control," he snapped. Linda, pacing nearby, turned to him with that nervous, tight-lipped smile that appeared whenever she was cornered. "You need to calm down. We can fix this." "Fix it?" He laughed bitterly. "How?" "He's turning the whole town against me." "You can't let him control the narrative," she said quickly. "You need to push back. Make him look unstable." David looked at her, breathing hard. "You mean make him look senile?" Linda hesitated, then nodded. "It's not a lie if it's what people already think." And so, the next morning, another story hit the local news. This one came from David's side, a polished statement sent through his lawyer, painting George as a confused old man, misled by misguided advisors, and struggling with age-related paranoia. It spread fast. Social media picked it up like wildfire. Some readers pitied George, others began to question him again. Maybe he really doesn't remember signing. One comment read, "Happens with dementia." George read that one 3 times. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from fury. "He's calling me insane," he whispered. Sarah's voice shook with rage. "He's desperate, Dad. That's what liars do when they start losing." Anna poured him another cup of tea, her movements careful, steady. "Let them talk," she said. "The truth doesn't vanish because fools refuse to see it." George looked at his sister, then at his daughter, and for the first time in months, his back straightened. The weight that had bent him began to lift, replaced by a quiet, burning dignity. "He can call me what he wants," he said, "but when this is over, everyone will know who's really gone mad." That night, while David rehearsed talking points for his next interview, Sarah posted her own statement online, a long, heartfelt message with old family photos, stories of her father's honesty and sacrifice, and a simple caption beneath them, "My father isn't crazy. He's brave." By morning, it had gone viral in their small town. The photo of George in his army uniform, a younger man, proud, steady-eyed, was shared hundreds of times. Comments flooded in. "God bless him." "You can see the truth in that man's face." "Justice for George Miller." The tide was shifting. In the quiet of Anna's kitchen, George watched the comments appear on Sarah's phone. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, but his eyes remained solemn. "They're not fighting for me," he said softly. "They're fighting for what's right." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Then let them." But miles away, behind the drawn curtains of the stolen house, David stared at the same posts, his jaw clenched, eyes hollow. The mask of confidence was gone. He could feel it, control slipping through his fingers like sand. He slammed his laptop shut, the sound echoing in the empty room. Outside, the wind howled, bending the trees. The storm that George had been waiting for was no longer approaching. It was already here. The news hit George like a gut punch, though he should have seen it coming. One morning, a thick envelope arrived by courier. Its weight alone told him what it was. Inside, crisp legal papers spelled it out clearly. David Miller v. George Miller. Allegations of defamation, libel, and emotional distress. His son was suing him. Sarah read through the pages, her face paling as she turned each one. "He's saying you've ruined his reputation," she whispered. "He's claiming damages for public humiliation." George gave a quiet, bitter laugh. Humiliation. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned. He did that to himself the day he threw his father into the street. The second round of court hearings began within weeks. The courthouse now a battlefield where truth and manipulation clashed like steel. The gallery was fuller than before, neighbors, reporters, curious onlookers who had chosen sides long ago. Each day felt heavier, longer, as though time itself refused to move until justice chose a direction. David entered the courtroom each morning with that same polished arrogance, tailored suits, chin high, a mask of control. But beneath it, George could see the strain, the slight twitch in his son's jaw when Harris appeared, the forced smile when cameras turned toward him. The first hearing of David's new lawsuit played out like theater. David's lawyer painted him as the victim, a successful man whose father's delusions had destroyed his credibility. "Mr. Miller has endured relentless public harassment," the attorney declared. "He has lost clients, business partners, and peace of mind because of his father's false accusations." George's attorney, Russell Payne, stood when the judge nodded. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "my client's only crime was speaking the truth. We will prove that everything Mr. George Miller has stated was based on documented evidence, evidence that continues to grow. Detective Harris was called to the stand again, this time carrying a new folder of findings. His tone was steady, his words surgical. We've uncovered further irregularities in the defendant's financial records. Mr. David Miller diverted business funds into private accounts, some in his wife's name. In addition, several contractors claim they were never paid for services rendered during the home renovation. There are now indications of tax evasion. The room rippled with noise. The judge called for order, her gavel striking the bench sharply. Across the aisle, David's face flushed red, his hand tightening into a fist beneath the table. Linda looked pale, her eyes darting from Harris to her husband. The tension between them was no longer subtle, it radiated. When the session adjourned, the hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters crowded near the doors, their flashes lighting up the marble walls. George ignored them, walking slowly down the corridor, Sarah at his side. He'd learned to tune out the noise, but that afternoon, as he waited outside his lawyer's office, a familiar voice called softly from behind him. "George?" He turned. Linda stood there, wrapped in a long coat, her face drawn and weary. The arrogance she'd always worn like perfume was gone. "Can I talk to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. George studied her for a long moment. "Haven't you said enough?" "Please," she whispered. "Just a minute." They stepped into the quiet of a side corridor away from the crowd. She hesitated, wringing her hands. "I didn't know it would go this far," she said. "David, he's not the same anymore. He's angry all the time, paranoid. He doesn't sleep. You've proven your point. Can't you just stop this?" George's expression hardened. "Stop this," he repeated. "Linda, you laughed while he threw me out of my own home. Do you remember that?" Her lips trembled. "I was scared, George. He made me choose." "You don't understand what he's like when—" "Don't you dare play the victim," George cut in, his voice quiet but razor sharp. "You both made choices. You stood beside him while he destroyed his family for money. And now that the walls are closing in, you want sympathy." Tears welled in her eyes, smudging her mascara. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." George looked at her for a long, silent moment, his face unreadable. "Then you should have thought of that before you helped him forge my name." She flinched as though struck. Without another word, Linda turned and hurried down the hall, her heels clicking fast against the tile until the sound faded completely. George stood there alone, the quiet returning like a tide. Sarah approached a few minutes later, having seen the tail end of the encounter. "What did she want?" she asked softly. "To feel better," George said. "Some people call that an apology." Sarah's eyes filled with quiet pride. "You didn't give it to her, did you?" He shook his head. "No, not yet." Later that evening, as he sat by the window with the courthouse lights still glowing in the distance, Harris called. "You did well today," the detective said. "David's losing control. The documents we found, those payments, the shell accounts, they'll end this." George said nothing at first. His gaze lingered on the horizon, where the last light of day bled into darkness. "End it?" he repeated. "No, Harris. It's just beginning." The line went quiet for a beat. Then Harris said, "You really think he's close to breaking?" George leaned back in his chair, the faintest trace of a grim smile forming. "He already is. He just doesn't know it yet." Outside, the courthouse clock struck 9, its echo stretching across the empty streets, a countdown George could almost feel in his bones. The days after the second hearing were tense and airless, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Sarah couldn't bear the silence anymore. Every headline, every whispered conversation in the grocery store was about her family. Her father painted as a fighter, her brother as a fraud. And somewhere between the two stood her, torn in half. She hadn't spoken to David since the courtroom, but that morning, she drove to his house anyway. The sky was gray and rain streaked across the windshield, blurring the world outside. She told herself she was doing the right thing, that maybe, just maybe, there was still a piece of the brother she used to know left inside him. When David opened the door, his face hardened immediately. "Oh," he said flatly. "You." She tried to smile, but it came out weak. "Can we talk?" He hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. The house felt colder than she remembered, sterile, lifeless, the scent of bleach hanging in the air. Linda was nowhere to be seen. Sarah followed him into the living room, where unopened mail and empty coffee cups littered the table. He looked tired, his once perfect composure cracking around the edges. "David," she began softly, "this has to stop. You're destroying everything. Your marriage, your business, this family." He laughed sharply without humor. "Destroying? Don't lecture me, Sarah. You and Dad started this circus. You let him drag my name through the mud, and now you're here to fix me?" She swallowed hard. "He didn't drag your name through the mud. You did that when you forged his signature." David's face twisted, anger flashing in his eyes. "You believe him? That senile old man? You think he's innocent in all this?" "He's not senile," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "He's hurt, and you're the one who hurt him." He stood abruptly, pacing like a caged animal. "You have no idea what it's like trying to live up to him. You think he was this saint. He made me feel like a failure from the day I was born. I built something, Sarah, something real, and he's trying to take it away from me." Sarah rose too, her tone sharper now. "You built it on lies, David. You didn't earn a thing. You stole it." The words hung between them like shards of glass. David's voice broke, the fury tipping toward desperation. "Everything I've done was for this family, for us, but he never saw that. He never believed in me. And now you don't either." Tears stung her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I believed in you more than anyone, David. I defended you when no one else would. But look at yourself. You're standing in a house built on fraud, screaming at the only person who still tried to love you." He froze, chest heaving, eyes wild. "You think you're better than me?" He spat. "You've always been on his side, always." "Because he's right," she said quietly, "and deep down, you know it." Something in him broke then. He turned away, hands trembling, voice cracking. "Get out," he said. "David, I said get out," he shouted, spinning to face her. "Go run back to him. Tell him he's won." Sarah stood there for a long moment, her heart shattering piece by piece. Then she nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "He didn't win," she said softly. "You lost yourself." She walked to the door, pausing only once to glance back. David stood in the center of the room, his shoulders hunched, his face hidden in his hands. The anger was gone now. Only something hollow remained. When Sarah returned to her father's house, she didn't speak right away. George was sitting in his chair by the window, reading over another set of documents from Harris. He looked up when he saw her face and didn't need to ask what happened. "You went to see him," he said quietly. She nodded, her voice breaking. "He's gone, Dad. Whatever part of him cared about this family, it's gone." George set the papers aside, his eyes softening. "You did what you had to." Tears spilled freely now. "I hate that it hurts this much." He reached for her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "That's because you still have a heart, Sarah. Don't lose it, no matter what he's lost." She leaned against him, silent sobs shaking her shoulders. George stared out the window, his expression unreadable. Beneath the sadness in his eyes was something else. Something colder. He was proud of her strength, but her pain only deepened his resolve. David had crossed the final line. That night, George sat awake long after everyone had gone to bed, the rain tapping against the glass. For the first time, the house felt both peaceful and heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. David had lost his last ally. The fortress of lies he'd built was starting to crumble, brick by brick. And George knew that when it fell, he would be ready to deliver the final blow. The storm finally broke, rain slamming against the windows of Anna's small home as thunder rolled through the night. Inside, the house was dim, the only light coming from the kitchen lamp where George sat quietly at the table, a half-empty cup of tea beside him. His shoulders were hunched but steady, the exhaustion of months buried beneath a calm resolve. Anna moved about the kitchen in silence, the rhythmic clink of dishes filling the air. Neither spoke much anymore. Words had become fragile things, easily shattered by truth. But tonight, even that fragile peace was about to end. A car screeched outside, tires slicing through puddles. Anna's head snapped toward the window. Who the hell is that at this hour? Before George could answer, the front door burst open with a violent crack. David stumbled inside, soaked from the rain, rage burning in his eyes like wildfire. His face was red, hair disheveled, breath ragged. "You!" he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at his father. "You'll pay for this." Anna froze, clutching the counter. George didn't move. He simply turned his gaze toward his son, the calm in his eyes cutting sharper than any blade. "David," he said evenly, "you shouldn't be here." "Don't you dare talk to me like that," David shouted, voice cracking. "You think you can ruin me? You think you can drag my name through the dirt and get away with it?" George's voice was quiet, controlled. "You did that yourself." That only fed the fire. David slammed his fist onto the table, sending the teacup flying. It shattered against the floor, fragments scattering like teeth. Anna gasped. "You destroyed me," David roared. "You've turned everyone against me. The bank froze my accounts. My business is gone. Linda's—" He stopped abruptly, chest heaving. "Linda's what?" George asked, his tone flat. David's eyes flicked away, shame creeping into his fury. "She left," he muttered. "Because of you." Anna stepped forward, her voice trembling. "David, that woman left because she's terrified of what you've become." He turned on her, his expression feral. "Stay out of this, Anna," he spat. "This is between me and him." He advanced on George, his footsteps heavy, dangerous. For a moment, the years of distance between father and son disappeared, replaced by the raw, ugly truth of what they'd become. "You were supposed to love me," David said, his voice breaking now. "You were supposed to believe in me. But no, you always saw me as the screw-up, didn't you? Always compared me to Sarah. Always said I was too selfish. Well, look at me now, old man. Look at what your disappointment built." George rose slowly, leaning on his cane. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made even David hesitate. "I didn't build this, son. You did. I gave you everything. Trust, love, a home, and you burned it all because you thought you deserved more. You took from me, from your sister, from this family. Don't you dare blame me for the ashes." David's jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. "You think you're better than me?" he hissed. George shook his head once. "No, just not broken like you." That did it. David lunged forward, rage overtaking reason. Anna screamed. The cane clattered to the floor as George stumbled back, bracing himself against the table. Before David could reach him, the front door swung open again, and Detective Harris stepped in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. "That's enough." Harris's voice cut through the chaos like thunder. David froze mid-step, chest heaving, his eyes wide and wild. The officers moved quickly, grabbing his arms before he could resist. "Let me go," he shouted, struggling against their grip. "He's lying. He's turning everyone against me." Harris's tone was cold and measured. "You're violating a restraining order, Mr. Miller. You need to calm down before this gets worse." David twisted, desperation breaking through the anger. "He's my father," he yelled. "He's the reason my life's falling apart." George stood still, breathing hard but unshaken. "No. David," he said quietly, "you're the reason." The fight drained out of him then. David's shoulders slumped as the officers led him toward the door. Outside, the rain poured harder, blurring his outline until he was just another shadow swallowed by the storm. Linda appeared in the doorway, soaked and trembling. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her voice barely a whisper. "I tried to stop him," she said, her words breaking. "He wouldn't listen." Harris gave a curt nod to the officers, then turned to George. "You all right?" George nodded, picking up his cane. "I'm fine." Linda stood there, crying silently, as David's voice echoed faintly from the patrol car. She turned to George, eyes red. "How did it come to this?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "You both mistook kindness for weakness," he said. "Now you know the difference." Linda sobbed, covering her face. Harris motioned her aside gently as the car pulled away, its headlights slicing through the rain. The sound faded, leaving behind only the storm. Anna stepped beside her brother, hand trembling on his arm. "George, I thought he was going to—" "I know," George interrupted softly, his gaze fixed on the door. "But it's done now." Harris nodded. "He'll be held overnight. There'll be another hearing soon. You should rest." As the detective left, George turned back toward the window. The rain streaked down the glass, each drop illuminated by the streetlight outside. His reflection stared back, older, wearier, but unbroken. Anna squeezed his hand. "It's finally ending, isn't it?" George's eyes didn't leave the window. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "No," he said. "The war is almost over." Outside, lightning tore across the sky. The morning air carried the weight of something final. The town had gone quiet in the days leading up to the trial, too quiet, like the breath before a storm breaks. For months, whispers and headlines had torn the Miller name apart, and now everything would come to a head in a single courtroom. Detective Harris arrived early at George's modest home, his coat slick with rain, a folder tucked under his arm. The air inside was thick with tension and the faint scent of coffee. Papers were spread across the table, neatly arranged by George himself. Testimonies, bank records, photographs, and every piece of evidence that had taken his shattered pride and turned it into purpose. "This is it," Harris said, setting down the folder. His tone was calm, but there was a current of electricity beneath it. The final drop. Every forged document, every fraudulent account, every dollar he moved. It's all here. Once this is presented, the case is airtight. George's hands, though old and trembling, moved with precision as he adjusted the papers. His eyes were sharp, alive with something Harris hadn't seen in him before. Not just resolve, but peace. "You've done good work, detective," he said softly. "Now, let's make it count." Harris studied him for a moment. "You sure you're up for this? You've been through hell, George. You could let your lawyer and me handle the rest." George shook his head. "No. This started with my name, and it'll end with my voice. I'll finish this." Anna entered from the kitchen, her face lined with worry. "You shouldn't be talking like that," she said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Your heart—" "My heart's been through worse," George interrupted, a faint smile touching his lips. "It's still beating, isn't it? That means it's got one more fight in it." Sarah stepped in next, clutching a stack of letters. Her eyes glimmered with both pride and sadness. "Dad," she said softly, "these are from the neighbors. Statements. Witnesses to what David did, what they saw, what they heard that night he threw you out." She placed them in front of him, and George looked down at the signatures, names he'd known all his life, people who had once turned away when he needed them most. Now they'd come back, not out of pity, but because truth has a way of pulling people back into its orbit. Seems they finally remember who I am, he murmured. Sarah smiled faintly. They always knew. They just needed reminding. The rain outside thickened, streaking down the window panes. Harris gathered the documents into a single, thick file, securing it with a clip before sliding it into his briefcase. Tomorrow, he said. This goes before the judge. Once it's in, David can't run anymore. No more loopholes, no more games. Anna exhaled shakily. Tomorrow, she repeated the word trembling. And what happens after that? What happens to you, George? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, watching the rain blur the view of the street. His reflection looked older than he remembered, but not weaker. After that, he said quietly, maybe I rest. Anna's eyes filled with tears. Don't talk like that. I'm not dying, Anna, he said with a gentle chuckle. I'm just tired of surviving. Sarah moved closer, slipping her hand into his. You're not alone anymore, she said. Whatever happens, we're in this together. He squeezed her hand back. That's what keeps me standing. Harris cleared his throat, trying to lighten the heavy silence. You know, he said, in all my years, I've never seen someone fight like this, especially not at 70. Most men would have given up a long time ago. George looked at him, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. That's because most men never had everything stolen from them by their own blood. The detective nodded slowly, his respect unspoken, but understood. Then let's make sure he pays for it. They spent the rest of the afternoon in preparation. Harris rehearsed the sequence of evidence presentation. Sarah cross-checked witness statements. Anna brewed pot after pot of coffee, though none of them drank much. The ticking clock filled the pauses between words, marking time as they edged closer to the reckoning. As night fell, Harris packed up and prepared to leave. The rain had stopped, but thunder still grumbled on the horizon. At the door, he turned back. Try to get some rest, he said. Tomorrow, you get your justice. George nodded, though he knew there would be no rest. Not tonight. Justice, he echoed. It's been a long time coming. After Harris left, the house settled into uneasy quiet. Anna went to her room, Sarah lingered on the couch, and George stayed by the window. He could see the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement, the faint fog curling through the air. His mind drifted to memories he couldn't quite silence. David as a boy, laughing as he ran through puddles, shouting, "Come on, Dad." That same voice now echoed in courtrooms and lies, in greed and ruin. George's eyes misted. You had every chance, he whispered. Every chance to be better than me. Sarah stirred behind him, half asleep on the couch. Dad? He turned, his voice soft. Go to bed, sweetheart. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. When she finally went upstairs, he remained at the window. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache and exhaustion, there was calm. The kind that comes when a man has nothing left to prove, only something to finish. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the wet streets in stark white. The reflection of George's face in the glass looked almost ghostly, but the eyes were alive, focused, unwavering. He whispered the words to himself like a vow. I'll finish this. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, slow and deliberate, each ring echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Tomorrow, the gavel would strike, and when it did, fate would finally choose a side. The courthouse was overflowing before sunrise. The final trial of Miller versus Miller had drawn the entire town, every seat filled, every whisper thick with anticipation. Even the reporters stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, cameras poised, ready to witness the end of a story that had split the community in half. George arrived quietly, escorted by Sarah and Anna. He wore his old suit, worn at the elbows but neatly pressed. His tie, the same one he'd worn at his wedding, his son's graduation, and now his reckoning. His cane tapped softly against the marble floor as he entered, each step steady, deliberate. David was already there, seated beside his team of lawyers. His suit was immaculate, his hair perfectly styled, but his eyes betrayed the sleepless nights. Still, he wore that same smirk, the one that once passed for confidence, but now reeked of arrogance. When George entered, David leaned back in his chair, whispering something to his attorney, before flashing his father a cold grin. George met his gaze, then turned away. He didn't need to match hate with hate. Truth would do that for him. The judge entered, commanding silence. The room rose, then sat again as the gavel struck once. This court will now hear Miller v. Miller, case number 3275, in full trial proceedings. George's lawyer, Russell Payne, stood first. Your Honor, we will prove today beyond doubt that my client, George Miller, was the victim of a deliberate and malicious forgery. We will show financial documents, digital traces, and even first-hand testimony to confirm that Mr. David Miller knowingly falsified his father's signature to seize property and assets not rightfully his. David's lawyer rose next, voice slick and confident. Your Honor, this is a tragic misunderstanding being twisted by emotion. My client is a respected businessman. The plaintiff is an elderly man under stress, influenced by outside parties with their own motives. We intend to prove this case is nothing but slander born of confusion. The judge nodded. Proceed. Detective Harris was the first to take the stand. He carried himself with quiet authority, his testimony calm and measured. He began by establishing the chain of investigation, how the forgery came to light, the inconsistencies found, and the trail of money uncovered. Then came the documents. Exhibit 12, he said, handing them to the bailiff. The original deed transfer and the notarized copy found in the defendant's records, both allegedly signed by Mr. George Miller. However, forensic handwriting analysis confirms the signature on the transfer does not match the plaintiff's verified records from the last 40 years. The screen beside the jury flickered to life. Two signatures appeared side by side, the authentic one flowing smoothly, the forged one jittery, uneven. Harris pointed to the differences, explaining in detail. The forger attempted to replicate the father's hand, but lacked consistency in letter formation. The slant here, the hesitation marks, clear signs of simulation. The jury leaned forward, studying the display. A murmur rippled through the room. George sat motionless, hands folded, eyes lowered. It wasn't pride he felt, nor anger. Just the weight of truth finally standing where it belonged. Russell nodded toward Harris. Detective, in your professional opinion, who stands to gain from this forgery? Only one person, Harris replied firmly. David Miller. A quiet gasp ran through the courtroom. David shifted in his seat, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. The next blow came harder. Harris introduced the financial evidence. Bank records appeared on the screen. Transfers, withdrawals, and fake invoices, all leading back to accounts under David's name. Here, Harris said, pointing, we see a direct transfer of funds, nearly $150,000, secured using the stolen property as collateral. Each transaction was routed through secondary shell accounts. And accompanying those records are voice logs obtained from the defendant's business line. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the audio began to play. David's voice filled the room, clear, confident, unmistakable. It's all squared away. The old man doesn't even know I moved it. Free house, free cash. Easy. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to pause. Linda, seated behind David, went pale. Her hands trembled. The jury turned to look at her as if sensing the next fracture before it happened. Russell stepped forward. Mrs. Linda Miller, would you please take the stand? David's head snapped toward her. Don't, he hissed under his breath, but the judge's voice overrode his warning. Mrs. Miller, please approach. Linda rose slowly. as though her body might break under the weight of her own choices. When she reached the stand, she avoided everyone's gaze, especially David's. Russell approached gently. "Mrs. Miller, you were present when your husband filed the property transfer, correct?" She hesitated, voice trembling. "Yes." "And you knew it was forged?" David slammed a fist on the table. "Objection." "Overruled," the judge said sharply. "Answer the question." Linda's lip quivered. Tears welled in her eyes as she finally looked toward George. He sat quietly, his gaze steady, not accusing, just waiting. "Yes," she whispered. "I knew." The courtroom gasped. One juror covered her mouth. Another shook his head. Russell's voice softened. "Why did you go along with it?" Linda's tears spilled freely now. "He said it would fix everything, that it was just a formality. He promised no one would get hurt. But when I saw him throw you out, George," her voice cracked, "when I saw your things in the trash, I knew it wasn't about family anymore. It was about greed." David's chair scraped loudly as he stood. "Shut up, Linda," he shouted. "You don't know what you're saying." The judge's gavel slammed down. "Order! Mr. Miller, sit down or you'll be removed from this courtroom." But David wasn't listening. His voice rose, wild and frantic. "You think you can all turn on me? You think he's some kind of saint? He's been manipulating everyone." "Enough," the judge thundered. "Sit down." Two bailiffs moved forward, their presence enough to make him stop. He collapsed back into his chair, breathing hard, his face red with fury. Linda covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The judge turned to the jury, her voice firm but composed. "You will disregard the outburst. This court will reconvene tomorrow for closing statements." The gavel struck again, sharp and final. As people began to file out, the room buzzed with a mixture of shock and awe. Reporters whispered furiously into recorders. Neighbors who had once doubted George avoided his gaze, ashamed. Sarah reached for her father's hand. "It's over, isn't it?" she whispered. George looked at the empty chair where his son had sat moments earlier, his voice low but steady. "Not yet," he said, "but the walls are finally closing in." Outside, the courthouse bell rang 6 times, each echo heavier than the last, like the countdown of a man's empire collapsing. The final morning of the trial arrived wrapped in silence. No reporters shouted questions. No murmurs filled the courtroom. Even the air seemed to wait. George Miller sat in the front row beside his lawyer, the weight of months, years even, pressing down on his shoulders. His hands trembled slightly on his cane, but his eyes were steady. Across the aisle, David sat rigid, pale, his once polished arrogance stripped bare. His suit looked sharp, but his composure had frayed, jaw tight, eyes hollow. Linda was nowhere to be seen. Rumor whispered she'd left town the night before. The gavel struck once. "Court is now in session," the judge announced. Her tone was firm, measured, carrying the gravity of finality. "We will now hear the ruling in the matter of Miller versus Miller." For a moment, the only sound was the faint shuffle of papers. George's heart thudded softly in his chest, a rhythm he could feel in his fingertips. The judge began, her voice calm but deliberate. "After reviewing all presented evidence, the forensic documents, the financial records, the recorded conversations, and the sworn testimonies of witnesses, this court finds that the deed transfer of the Miller residence was executed under fraudulent means." A ripple moved through the audience. David's lawyer shifted in his seat, already knowing what was coming. The judge continued, her eyes now fixed on David. "Mr. David Miller, the evidence overwhelmingly supports that you forged your father's signature for the purpose of transferring property and securing financial gain through deception. This court therefore finds you guilty of fraud and forgery." The word guilty struck the room like thunder. David flinched as if the air itself had turned against him. A few gasps erupted in the gallery. George sat still, his breath catching, half disbelief, half release. "Furthermore," the judge went on, This court orders that the Miller property be legally restored to its rightful owner, Mr. George Miller, effective immediately. The defendant, David Miller, is fined and faces sentencing for multiple counts of fraud, pending a separate criminal trial. The gavel came down, 3 sharp strikes. Final, absolute. George exhaled slowly, the air leaving him like a sigh he'd been holding for years. He didn't raise his fists in victory. He didn't speak. He simply closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if letting the weight of justice settle into his bones. Sarah, seated just behind him, broke first. She covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling down her cheeks. Then she reached forward, wrapping her arms around her father from behind. "You did it," she whispered through sobs. "Dad, you did it." George turned slightly, his hand finding hers. "We did it," he said quietly. "Truth did it." Anna stood to the side, tears glimmering in her eyes, but a proud smile spreading across her face. She'd spent the last year watching her brother's heart fracture and mend again in front of her. Now, for the first time, she saw something close to peace return to him. "I told you," she said softly. "The truth never stays buried." David slumped forward in his chair, his lawyer whispering frantically beside him. But the fight was gone. He wasn't listening. His shoulders sagged, his eyes fixed on the floor where his world had collapsed. For all his scheming, for all his deceit, he looked now like a child, angry, lost, broken by his own doing. The bailiff approached to escort him out for processing. As he passed his father, David hesitated for the briefest second. George didn't speak. He didn't gloat or condemn. He simply looked at him, eyes heavy with something beyond anger, something like grief. David looked away first. The courtroom slowly began to empty, the buzz of conversation rising like the low hum of rain after thunder. Reporters whispered about sentencing, about the scandal, about redemption. But none of that mattered to George. He sat still in his chair, his daughter's hand in his, the faintest tremor in his chest. "You all right?" Sarah asked softly. He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth trembling. "I'm all right now." Anna moved closer, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Mom would be proud," she said quietly. George didn't trust his voice enough to answer. He simply nodded, his gaze drifting toward the courtroom window. Outside, sunlight filtered through the clouds for the first time in days, cutting a soft beam across the floor. It glowed over his cane, his wrinkled hands, his face. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. The air felt lighter, clean. As they left the courtroom together, George, Sarah, and Anna, the sound of the gavel still echoed faintly in his mind. It wasn't just the sound of judgment, it was the sound of restoration, of something broken being made whole again. But as the courthouse doors closed behind them, George paused on the steps, staring out at the world he'd fought to reclaim. Victory felt strange, quiet, almost fragile. He took one last look back toward the courtroom where his son still sat surrounded by officers, and whispered to himself, "It's over." Yet even as he said it, a chill wind swept through the air, tugging at his coat. He knew better than to believe peace came easily. The war was won, but peace would take longer. The story exploded across every local channel within hours of the verdict. Son betrays father, loses everything. The headline ran like wildfire, printed in bold black across newspaper stands, plastered on news websites, and whispered across small-town diners. The fall of David Miller wasn't just news, it was spectacle. The same reporters who once chased George for sympathy shots now swarmed to capture the ruins of David's image. Photos of him leaving the courthouse, disheveled, handcuffed, face drained of arrogance, circulated online with captions that cut deep. The son who forgot his roots, from pride to prison. George didn't read most of it. Sarah filtered the noise, setting aside only the articles that mattered, the ones that told the truth. Still, Even without the words, he could feel it. The world had turned. In the quiet of Anna's kitchen, the television murmured in the background. A news anchor spoke in solemn tones. Today, the community reels as the story of betrayal and justice between George and David Miller continues to dominate headlines. What was once a respected family name now stands as a cautionary tale of greed, deception, and the price of forgetting where you came from. George sipped his coffee slowly, the cup warm in his calloused hands. His eyes were distant, fixed not on the TV, but on the light spilling through the window. Outside, the streets were alive again, neighbors talking, children playing, the town returning to its rhythm. But this time, when people passed him on the sidewalk, they didn't look away. They nodded. Some even stopped to shake his hand. He didn't smile back. He simply nodded, quiet, steady, the way he used to after finishing a hard day's work at the shop. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Sarah said, her voice gentle as she joined him. He looked at her, a faint smile flickering. "Strange how?" "To be seen again," she said, "for people to finally remember who you are." George gave a slow nod. "I never cared about being seen, just about being heard." Sarah leaned against the counter beside him. "You were, loud and clear." Across town, the story was different. David's name had become poison. His business partners pulled out, clients vanished overnight, and the once busy auto dealership he'd bragged about stood half empty, its "for sale" sign flapping in the wind. The employees avoided eye contact, whispers following him everywhere he went. Even the neighbors who once admired his confidence now crossed the street when they saw him coming. Some muttered under their breath, others stared in pity. But no one spoke to him. The man who had once strutted through town with his head high now walked with it lowered, his expensive shoes splashing through puddles he didn't bother to avoid. Inside the house that had once been his trophy, silence hung like smoke. The furniture remained immaculate, but there was no warmth in it anymore. Linda stood in the living room, suitcase open beside her, folding clothes in quiet fury. David hovered in the doorway, his voice brittle. "You're really leaving?" She didn't look up. "I already did, David. I just came back for my things." He stepped closer, desperate. "You think you're any better? You helped me do this." Finally, she looked at him, eyes tired, voice flat. "I helped you because I was stupid enough to believe you were doing it for us. But you weren't. You were doing it for yourself. You lost everything because you couldn't stop taking." He stared at her, words failing him for the first time. She zipped the suitcase, brushed past him, and paused at the door. "You should have listened to your father before you tried to become him." Then she was gone. The slam of the door echoed through the hollow house, and David stood there, motionless, surrounded by the ghosts of his choices. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was punishing. Back on Main Street, George took his usual morning walk, cane tapping against the pavement. The chill in the air was softer now, the winter easing into early spring. People greeted him as he passed, the grocery clerk, the mailman, even the pastor who had once avoided his pew. "Good to see you back on your feet, George," one man said. George tipped his head politely. "Always was," he said simply. Sarah walked beside him, matching his slow, steady pace. Her arm brushed against his, her warmth grounding him. "Feels like a lifetime ago," she said quietly. He nodded. In some ways, it was. They stopped at the park, near the bench where he used to sit with his wife years ago. The same oak tree still stood nearby, its bare branches reaching for the sky. George sat down, exhaling deeply. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them hummed, children laughing in the distance, a dog barking, the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Do you feel like it's over now?" George looked out across the park, his expression unreadable. Over. He thought about it for a long time before answering. "Justice, maybe. But not everything you lose can be given back. Sarah nodded, eyes glistening. Maybe not, but you didn't lose yourself. That's what matters. He turned to her, his hand resting gently over hers. Maybe that's the only kind of revenge that lasts, he said softly. They sat there together, the sun breaking through the clouds, casting warm light across George's weathered face. His breathing slowed, steady, content in a way it hadn't been for years. He had walked through humiliation, grief, and betrayal, and somehow come out on the other side, still standing. As they rose to leave, George looked back once more at the street that had seen his downfall and his rise again. The people who once turned their backs now nodded respectfully. Sarah smiled through her tears. You did it, Dad. George gave a small, knowing smile. No, he said. Truth did. And for the first time in a long time, he felt it. The quiet satisfaction of balance restored. The war was over. But somewhere deep inside, in the faint ache behind his ribs, George could still feel the echo of everything it had cost him. The courtroom was colder this time. The echo of footsteps seemed sharper, louder, as if even the walls knew what was coming. The verdict had already been decided. Today was about punishment. The benches were full again, but the energy was different. Muted, uneasy. People whispered only in short breaths, eyes fixed on the man at the defense table. David Miller sat still, his wrists bound in silver cuffs that caught the morning light. The expensive suits were gone. The polished image was gone. What sat there now was a man hollowed out by pride, his face pale and drawn, his eyes burning with quiet fury. George sat across the aisle, his cane resting by his side, his expression unreadable. Sarah sat beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. Anna was behind them, her breath steady, her gaze firm. The judge entered, robe flowing, voice firm as she called the court to order. This sentencing, she began, comes after the jury found Mr. David Miller guilty on multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and falsification of property documents. The shuffle of papers followed, then silence. David stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He looked like a man frozen in the moment between arrogance and ruin. The judge continued, her tone steady but heavy with finality. Mr. Miller, the evidence presented against you was clear and overwhelming. You forged your father's signature, defrauded banks, and manipulated those closest to you for personal gain. Your actions not only violated the law, but betrayed the sacred trust of family. Her gaze softened briefly as it fell on George, who sat motionless, his face lined with both pain and restraint. For these crimes, she said, turning back to David, this court sentences you to 8 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 6. The sound of the gavel cracked through the silence like a gunshot. David's shoulders jerked, the finality of it sinking in. The murmurs began immediately, whispers, shifting feet, the faint click of reporters' cameras. Sarah inhaled sharply, but she didn't look up. George didn't move. His expression didn't change. He just stared ahead, his eyes distant. David finally turned to look at him. The venom in his glare could have cut glass. Years of resentment, humiliation, and rage condensed into that single look. If his hands were free, the whole courtroom could feel what he might have done. George met his eyes calmly. No triumph, no anger, just an old, weary sadness. For a fleeting second, father and son saw each other not as enemies, but as two broken men who had both lost too much to pride. Then the bailiff moved in. Time to go. David stood, the clink of his handcuffs breaking the moment. He turned once more, but Sarah didn't look at him. Her head stayed bowed, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. He let out a bitter laugh. Can't even look at your brother? He spat. You think you're better than me? You're just his puppet now. Sarah didn't respond. She didn't have to. The guard's hand on David's arm pushed him forward. His footsteps echoed across the tile, heavy, hollow, final. When the door shut behind him, the sound lingered like thunder. Outside, the air was alive with noise. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, microphones raised, cameras flashing. "Mr. Miller, how does it feel to see justice served? Do you have any message for your son? George, was it worth it?" George said nothing. Sarah shielded him as they made their way down the steps, Anna close behind. The questions followed like flies, but he moved through them like mist, silent, steady. When they reached the car, Sarah opened the door for him. "Dad," she said softly, her voice breaking, "it's over now." George paused, one hand on the door frame, his gaze lifting toward the gray sky. "Over," he murmured, "maybe for him." Then he climbed into the car, closing the door behind him. The cameras flashed one last time, capturing the image of an old man sitting quietly in the back seat, eyes forward, face expressionless, as the car pulled away from the courthouse. Behind him, the doors closed on the noise, on the questions, on everything that had torn his life apart. And though the world now called it justice, the silence that filled George's chest felt less like victory and more like the echo of something he could never truly get back. The key turned in the lock with a quiet click, and for the first time in nearly a year, George stepped back into the house that had once been his, and then stolen from him. The door creaked open slowly, the smell of dust and faint wood polish greeting him like a ghost from another life. He stood in the doorway, motionless, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. The air inside felt different, thinner, emptier. The echo of his footsteps followed him as he walked through the living room, each step stirring old memories from the corners of his mind. The walls were bare now. The furniture was rearranged, newer, colder. David's touch was still there, in the modern fixtures, the gleaming appliances, the things that never belonged. But beneath it all, George could still feel her presence, his late wife, Martha. The way she'd filled this space with laughter, with warmth, with life. He stopped in front of the old mantel where her photo still stood, miraculously untouched. The frame had been moved aside during the renovations, but someone, maybe Sarah, had placed it back exactly where it had always been. George reached out, running his fingers along the edge of the picture, his eyes softening. "We won," he whispered, voice barely audible. The words didn't sound like triumph. They sounded like relief, like a man trying to convince himself that peace was something he still knew how to feel. The afternoon light poured through the windows, golden and soft. He moved to the window, looking out into the backyard. The grass had grown wild since he'd last walked it, but it was still the same patch of earth where he'd once built a swing for David, where he'd planted roses for Martha. The ghosts of those moments clung to the air like perfume, faint but unshakable. Behind him, the door opened again. Anna's voice broke the silence. "You didn't wait for me?" George turned with a small, tired smile. "Didn't think I needed an escort to step into my own home." Anna set a brown paper bag on the counter, her tone gentle but teasing. "You always think you don't need anyone. I figured I'd bring lunch before you start pretending you can still cook." He chuckled softly, easing himself into a chair. "You always did think you were the boss." "Someone had to be," she replied, pulling out a couple of sandwiches and setting them on the table. But as she looked around, her smile faltered. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" George nodded slowly. "Strange," he said, "and quiet." She glanced at him. "Too quiet." He didn't answer right away. His eyes wandered again, toward the staircase, the hallway, the old clock that still ticked faintly in the background. "When Martha was alive," he said, "this place used to hum. You could feel life in the walls. Now it just echoes." Anna reached across the table, resting her hand on his. "It'll fill again, George. Give it time." Before he could respond, laughter erupted outside, light, playful, innocent. Sarah's children were running through the yard, their shouts ringing through the open windows. George turned to look, his heart tightening at the sight. Sarah stood at the edge of the grass, watching her kids chase one another beneath the same tree where David once played as a boy. For a moment, George couldn't speak. His throat ached, his eyes shimmered with quiet emotion. Anna smiled softly beside him. "See, it's already filling again." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe you're right." He pushed himself up from the chair and walked to the back door, opening it slowly. The sound of the children's laughter rushed in, warm and bright. Sarah turned and waved at him. "Ted, come on, you have to see what they found." He stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath his feet. The sunlight hit his face, and for the first time in months, he let it. The yard was full of noise, laughter, the rustling of leaves, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Life was moving again. Anna joined him at the doorway, folding her arms with a quiet smile. "Told you," she said softly. "Peace comes back when you stop chasing it." George looked around, the children, the house, the sun, and nodded. "I think I'm starting to believe that." But as he turned back toward the house, his eyes caught the framed photograph of Martha through the window. The sunlight glinted off the glass, making it look almost alive. He lingered on it for a moment, whispering under his breath, "It's home again, love." The wind picked up, rustling the curtains gently. Somewhere deep inside, for the first time in a long time, George felt the beginnings of calm, not the sharp, burning relief of revenge, but something quieter. Peace wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It simply returned, like an old friend finding its way home. And yet, in that same silence, beneath the calm, George could still feel it, the faint ache of everything that had been lost, everything that could never be fully restored. The dream came soft at first, like a memory that had waited too long to be remembered. George stood in the golden haze of a summer afternoon, the smell of fresh-cut grass filling the air. The yard looked just as it had decades ago, alive, bright, untouched by time. And there he was, young David, no more than 8 years old, running barefoot through the yard, his laughter cutting through the air like music. "Come on, Dad," the boy shouted, his small arms waving. "You're too slow." George laughed, a deep, unguarded sound he hadn't heard from himself in years. He ran after him, the weight of his age gone, his knees strong again, his breath full. Martha stood on the porch, her apron fluttering in the breeze, smiling in that quiet, knowing way she always had. For a fleeting moment, life felt perfect again. The sunlight hit David's hair just right, turning it gold. George caught him, spinning him around as the boy shrieked with joy. "Gotcha," he said, laughing. "Told you I'm faster than you think." "Never," David cried, still laughing, still trying to wriggle free. Then the sound changed. The laughter faded, echoing, warping. The sunlight dimmed. The yard dissolved into shadow. When George looked down, David wasn't 8 anymore. He was grown, older, his face no longer innocent, his eyes filled with anger. "You taught me to fight," the older David said, his voice low, accusing. "But you never taught me when to stop." George tried to speak, but his throat tightened. "David." The shadow moved closer, swallowing the light. "You always said I'd thank you someday," the voice said. "This is my thanks." George reached out, but David's image broke apart like smoke in the wind. The sunlight vanished. The yard was gone. He woke with a gasp. The room was dark, the faint light from the window cutting across his face. His chest ached, sharp and sudden, his hand pressing over his heart as he fought for breath. The pain was familiar now, Dr. Green's warnings echoing in his head. But this time, it wasn't just his body that hurt. It was memory, regret, the weight of love lost too late. Tears ran down his cheeks before he even realized it. For the first time in years, George cried. Not from anger, not from humiliation, but from a grief too deep for words. He didn't hear Anna come in at first. She stood in the doorway, worry etched across her face. "George," she said softly, crossing the room, "you're shaking." He wiped at his face, embarrassed, but the tears kept coming. "It's nothing," he whispered. "Just a dream." Anna sat beside him on the edge of the bed, her hand finding his. "You were calling his name." He swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. He was little again, just a boy. I could almost feel his hand in mine. He paused, staring at the darkness beyond the window. "I keep thinking, maybe I could have done more. Maybe if I'd been softer, or stricter, or... God, I don't even know anymore." Anna squeezed his hand gently. "You can't rewrite what's already been written, George. You did what you thought was right." He shook his head. "Did I? Or did I just fail him before he ever had a chance?" Her eyes softened. "You didn't fail him. He failed himself. The truth still mattered." "You gave him that." He let out a bitter laugh. "Truth doesn't keep you warm at night." "No," Anna said quietly, "but lies destroy everything, and you stopped that." They sat in silence, the house breathing around them, the faint creak of wood, the ticking clock down the hall, the distant sound of rain against the roof. After a long pause, George spoke again. "You ever think about what it costs, Anna? Winning?" She turned to him, surprised. He looked down at his trembling hands. "I got my house back, my name, my dignity, but I lost my son, and somehow that feels like losing twice." Anna didn't answer. She just held his hand tighter. The door creaked open, and Sarah stepped inside, drawn by the low voices. She froze when she saw the tears on her father's face, her own eyes filling instantly. "Dad," she whispered, moving closer. "You shouldn't be up." He tried to smile. "Can't sleep." She sat on his other side, resting her head against his shoulder. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." He placed a trembling hand over hers. "You sound just like your mother." For a moment, the three of them sat together in silence. Outside, the rain slowed, and the first hints of dawn began to show in the sky. But even as light crept back into the room, shadows lingered in George's heart. Shadows of the boy he'd raised, the man he'd lost, and the love that still lived somewhere between them, too stubborn to die. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the curtains in thin golden lines, tracing soft patterns across the worn hardwood floor. The house was quiet, too quiet, George thought, but the kind of quiet that felt peaceful this time. Not empty, not haunted, just still. A knock broke the silence. Dr. Green stepped inside, his familiar leather bag in hand, his face lined with concern and a hint of affection. "You never make it easy on me, George," he said, half smiling. "I tell you to rest, and you decide to remodel your entire garden instead." George gave a faint chuckle, setting aside his coffee cup. "I didn't do much, just trimmed a few bushes, wanted to make the place look right again." Dr. Green pulled up a chair and sat beside him. "You've been through more than most men could survive, but you've still got that spark in your eyes." "Old habit," George said. "It's hard to put it out." The doctor studied him for a moment, his tone softening. "You've done what you needed to do. You got justice. But now, it's time to think about what comes next." George frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Dr. Green leaned forward. "Your health's holding steady, but it's fragile. You know that. The heart doesn't fight forever, George. It's time you put things in writing. Your will, your wishes, everything that matters." The words hung in the air, heavy but not cruel. George nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that," he said quietly. Dr. Green placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Do it soon. Don't leave the people you love guessing. It's the last kindness a man can give. When the doctor left, the silence returned, but it wasn't lonely. George sat for a long time at the kitchen table, staring at the photo on the mantel. Martha, smiling in the sunlight, one arm wrapped around a young Sarah and David. The picture was old, slightly faded at the edges, but it still carried the warmth of the life they'd built. He picked it up carefully, running his thumb over the glass. You'd know what to do, he murmured. You always did. The decision came to him quietly, without hesitation or struggle. He'd spent years trying to hold on to what was his, and now that it was finally back, he realized it had never really been about ownership. It was about what he left behind. That evening, Anna came by. She found him at the same table, papers spread out in front of him. Old deeds, insurance forms, a notebook filled with his handwriting. You look like a man planning a heist, she joked gently. George smiled. Just trying to put my affairs in order. Dr. Green thinks I should have a will written up. Anna's smile softened. That's a good idea. You know, it's strange. We spend so much of our lives fighting for things, and then at the end, we give them away. George nodded slowly. I think that's the point, to make sure what's left behind goes to the right hands. She sat down beside him. And those hands belong to Sarah, I assume? He looked at her, a quiet gleam in his eyes. Her and the kids. Everything goes to them. The house, the savings, what's left of it. She's carried more than she ever should have. I want her to have something that can't be taken from her. Anna's throat tightened, her voice soft. She'll cry, you know. He smiled faintly. That's all right. Martha used to say tears are just how the heart breathes. Later that night, Sarah came by after putting her children to bed. When she saw the papers on the table, her breath caught. Dad, what's all this? George gestured for her to sit. It's time, he said simply. The house will be yours when I'm gone. For you and the kids, keep it safe. Keep it alive. Her eyes filled instantly, her voice trembling. Dad, don't talk like that. He reached across the table, taking her hand in both of his. It's not goodbye, sweetheart. It's just making sure you have what I fought for. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his hand. You've already given us everything, she whispered. George smiled faintly, the corners of his tired eyes crinkling. Not everything, he said. This house, this place, it's more than walls and wood. It's our story. Your mother's laughter is still in these rooms. My mistakes are in the floors. Your strength is in the walls. It's all part of it now. Sarah looked up at him through her tears. I'll take care of it, I promise. Anna, standing quietly in the doorway, nodded in approval, her own eyes glistening. George exhaled, a long, slow breath that carried something peaceful with it. Then it's settled, he said softly. The house is home again, and now it has a future. He leaned back in his chair, gazing at the photo of his wife once more. His hand rested gently over his chest, and a faint smile curved across his lips. For the first time in a long while, George felt something close to contentment. His war was over, his family safe, his legacy secure. But outside, as the wind whispered through the trees and dusk gathered at the windows, shadows still crept softly across the old wooden floor, as if reminding him that peace, like everything else, must always be guarded. It happened in the quiet hour before dawn. The house was still, wrapped in the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. George sat in his old armchair, the one Martha had bought decades ago, staring at the fading embers in the fireplace. His chest had felt heavy all night, an ache he'd learned to ignore, but this time it was different. The pain came sharp, sudden, like a fist tightening around his ribs. He gasped, reaching for the armrest, but his hand slipped. The mug beside him fell, shattering against the floor. He tried to call out, but the sound barely escaped his throat. The room spun, blurring into streaks of light and shadow. Upstairs, Sarah stirred at the noise. "Dad?" she called out, her voice echoing down the stairs. When there was no answer, panic shot through her chest. She ran, bare feet hitting the floor, the world narrowing to the sight of her father slumped in the chair, his face pale, his breathing ragged. "Dad," she screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. "Dad, stay with me." His eyes fluttered open for a moment. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice weak but steady. "Call Green." Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone, dialing with trembling fingers. "Dr. Green, it's my father. Please, he's not breathing right." The next few minutes blurred together. The sirens, the flashing lights, the cold air as the paramedics rushed in. George was barely conscious as they lifted him onto the stretcher. He could hear Sarah's voice breaking, calling his name over and over, and for a moment, he wanted to tell her not to cry. But the words wouldn't come. When he opened his eyes again, the sterile white ceiling of the hospital filled his vision. The beeping of machines pulsed softly in the background, keeping rhythm with the faint beat of his failing heart. Dr. B. Green stood beside the bed, adjusting an IV line. "You gave us a scare," Green said quietly, forcing a small smile. "You're a stubborn man, George." George tried to smile back. "Takes one to know one." Sarah and Anna entered the room moments later, their faces streaked with tears. Behind them, two small figures hesitated by the door, Sarah's children clutching each other's hands. "Dad." Sarah's voice broke as she took his hand. "Why didn't you tell me it was this bad?" He squeezed her fingers weakly. "Didn't want to make you worry. You've done enough worrying for one lifetime." Anna moved closer, placing her hand over his other. "You scared us," she whispered. "You can't go like this. Not yet." George's eyes softened. "I've been running on borrowed time for a while now. Maybe it's just time to pay it back." Dr. Green cleared his throat, his voice low. "He's stable for now," he said to them, but his eyes betrayed something heavier. "Let's just keep him resting." The room fell silent again, except for the faint hum of the heart monitor. George looked at his family, at Sarah's trembling chin, at Anna's red-rimmed eyes, at the grandchildren hovering near the foot of the bed. He motioned for them to come closer. "Come here," he murmured. The children approached slowly, their small hands finding his. His touch was warm, but fragile. "You remember something for me," he whispered. "Family. That's the only thing that matters. Promise me you'll take care of each other." The older child nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "We promise, Grandpa." George smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "Good. Then I can rest easy." He turned to Sarah, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I go now," he said, "I go in peace." Her tears came harder then, falling onto his hand. "Don't say that," she pleaded. "You're not going anywhere." He gave a slow, weak laugh. "You sound just like your mother." Anna wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, unable to speak. She could feel the truth pressing down on them all, the quiet, inevitable truth that victory had come at a cost too heavy to measure. George closed his eyes, his breathing shallow but calm. The monitor beeped steadily beside him, a fragile line between life and the peace he'd earned. As Sarah and Anna held his hands, the grandchildren nestled close, their small fingers wrapped around his. The family he'd fought for surrounded him now, alive, safe, and whole. But even as the room filled with love, a shadow of sorrow lingered, stretching long across the sterile floor. The cost of his revenge, every tear, every scar, had followed him here, to the edge of peace itself. And as the monitor continued its steady rhythm, the line between victory and loss grew impossibly thin. The prison loomed on the horizon like a slab of concrete against the pale morning sky. A cold wind swept across the parking lot as George stepped out of the car, his coat pulled tightly around him. Each step toward the entrance echoed in the empty air, his cane striking the pavement like the slow beat of a drum. Inside, the smell of disinfectant and rust mixed in the corridors. The guard at the front desk recognized his name and gave a slow nod, silent but understanding. "He's in visitation room 3, the man said, sliding a clipboard across the counter. George signed his name with a trembling hand. The letters came out shaky but legible, proof, he thought, that even time hadn't taken everything from him. They led him down a narrow hallway lined with steel doors. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above him, harsh and relentless. When they stopped at the visitation room, George took a slow breath. The guard opened the door, motioned him inside, and stepped out, leaving him alone with the sound of his own heartbeat. David sat on the other side of the glass. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The years between them hung heavier than the silence itself. David looked nothing like the son George remembered. His hair had thinned, his once sharp features hollowed. The arrogance that used to fill his posture was gone. His shoulders slumped forward, his eyes dim and bloodshot. The orange jumpsuit seemed to swallow him whole. When he finally lifted his gaze, the fury was still there, but buried now under exhaustion and something else. Resentment. Regret. "Didn't think you'd come," David said, his voice rough, like a man who hadn't spoken much in weeks. George sat down across from him, his cane resting against the table. "I almost didn't." David gave a faint, bitter laugh. "Guess you wanted to see what your victory looks like?" George's eyes narrowed slightly. "This isn't victory." David leaned forward, his voice low, shaky. "Then what is it? You've got your house back, your good name, your precious peace. I've got a cell and a number instead of a life. You won." The words hung between them, sharp and heavy. George looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You think I wanted this?" His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "You think I spent years dreaming about seeing my son behind bars?" David didn't answer. His eyes flicked away, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "I wanted you to do right," George continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I wanted to see the man I raised, the one who used to follow me to the shop just to hand me a wrench, just to make me proud. But you let greed eat away everything good inside you." David's jaw tightened. "You don't know what it was like," he muttered, "living in your shadow, watching you worship that damn house, that memory of Mom. I was tired of being the afterthought in your perfect story." George leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "You weren't the afterthought, David. You were the reason I worked every day after she died. Everything I did was to make sure you'd never struggle the way I did, and you threw it away." David's breathing quickened, his voice cracking with anger. "You call this my fault, but you never once asked what I wanted. All you cared about was control." "Control," George repeated softly, shaking his head. "No, son. I cared about family. You cared about possession." The silence stretched again, deep and jagged. Somewhere in the hallway, a door slammed, the sound reverberating through the room. David's shoulders sagged. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "I hate you," he said, the words trembling out of him like shards of glass. "But you won." George's eyes softened, and for a moment, all the years of anger and pain fell away. He saw not the broken man sitting before him, but the boy who used to run across their yard with scraped knees and bright eyes. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Truth won, that's all." David looked up then, confusion flickering through the exhaustion in his eyes. George rose slowly, gripping his cane, his movements deliberate. He hesitated for only a second, long enough for their eyes to meet. One last time. "Take care of yourself, David," he said softly. David's lips parted as if to say something, but no words came. George turned and walked toward the door. His cane tapped against the tile floor, echoing through the corridor like a metronome marking the end of something vast and heavy. When he reached the exit, the guard nodded to him again, opening the heavy metal door. George stepped into the light. The sun had broken through the clouds, filling the gray sky with streaks of gold. The light spilled through the barred windows of the prison, glinting off the steel and concrete. Behind him, the gates clanged shut, sealing the past where it belonged. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, the warmth of sunlight brushing against his weathered skin. The war between them was over, not in reconciliation, but in understanding that some things could never be fixed. George took one last look at the prison before walking toward the car. His shadow stretched long behind him, fading as the sunlight grew stronger. He didn't look back again. The truth had finally spoken for itself, and it was enough.